Beneath Idaho's quiet hills and lava plains lie secrets older than memory, vanished rivers, ghost villages, and stones that speak in riddles. Before the floods came, before the maps were drawn, something moved here, something we still don't understand. From clay dolls found 300 feet underground, to petroglyphs etched like forgotten equations, the land holds stories science can't finish. You're about to step into a world where every mystery is older than it should be, and none of them are solved. This is Idaho before the flood, and it refuses to stay buried. Before we dive in, if you love vanishing civilizations, unsolvable puzzles, and the eerie calm of deep time, hit subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. And while you're here, tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Montana? 3 a.m. in Tokyo? I want to know who's wandering this timeline with me. Cooper's Ferry's earliest occupation. It begins, as these things often do, with a river and a riddle. The Salmon River snakes through western Idaho like it's late for something fast, cold, and endlessly carving. Along its lower stretches, near the modern town of Cottonwood, there's a terrace, a quiet, unremarkable patch of land known as Cooper's Ferry. There's not much to look at. Some gravel, some willows, and if you didn't know better, you'd walk right over it. People did, for thousands of years. And then one day, someone started digging. What they found broke American prehistory in half. Beneath meters of sediment, archaeologists uncovered fire pits, stone tools, and butchered bones. All standard issue, until someone looked at the carbon dates and stopped breathing for a second. 16,000 years ago, maybe a little more. That's before Clovis. Clovis culture, for decades, was the prized firstborn of American archaeology. Sleek spear points, big game hunts, and a neat 13,000-year timestamp that everyone could write into textbooks and feel good about. But Cooper's Ferry? It was older. Not just slightly older, significantly. And that meant one thing: the story was wrong. The implications unraveled quickly. If humans were here before Clovis, they didn't walk in through the Bering Land Bridge when it thawed around 13,000 years ago. They'd have had to arrive earlier, possibly much earlier, and by some other means. A coastal route, a kelp highway along the Pacific Rim, inland corridors that melted open in fits and starts. No one could quite agree. What everyone did agree on was that the site shouldn't be here. And yet, it was. Cooper's Ferry wasn't just a fluke pit stop. Excavations revealed hearths, living surfaces, stone tools crafted with care, obsidian flakes traced back to distant sources. There was a long tradition of return here, a place remembered, revisited, and re-inhabited over generations. A seasonal camp, a spiritual site, maybe a trading hub for early peoples, bartering salmon for stone, stories for shelter. But here's the snag. We don't have their words. We barely have their bones. All we have is charcoal, stone, and shadows. Science, in its polite frustration, calls this a pre-Clovis occupation, which is a little like calling a thunderstorm a minor atmospheric perturbation. It undersells the chaos. Because if Cooper's Ferry is pre-Clovis, it rewrites how, when, and who got to the Americas first, and that opens the door to every historical taboo that tidy narratives like to keep shut. And there's something else. In one of the lowest, oldest layers, archaeologists found a small, simple projectile point. Not a Clovis point, no fluted elegance. This one was stemmed, humble, Western in form. And when compared to points in Hokkaido, Japan, it looked familiar. Not identical, but close enough to whisper. Could it be? Did a lineage of tool-making drift across the North Pacific, hugging ice and islands, long before the textbook migrations? Maybe. Or maybe it's coincidence, archaeological déjà vu. But then again, coincidences don't usually come buried under 15 feet of silt and time. The scientists tried to explain. They argued over models and corridors, flaked basalt and isotopes. Some called for caution. Let's not rewrite history just yet. Others, more honest, admitted it had already been rewritten. They were just the last to accept the edit. Because here's what keeps them up at night. Cooper's Ferry shouldn't exist. Not this old, not this deep, not with these artifacts. But it does. Which means someone walked into the Americas quietly, early, and possibly by a route no one mapped, while the mammoths still roamed and the glaciers hadn't finished their long goodbye. And then they stayed, long enough to leave behind fire pits and memories. Then the river covered it all in silence. So maybe you're wondering, who were they? What language did they speak? What did they believe? Did they bury their dead, sing to the stars, draw on rocks? Did they tell stories of where they came from? Did they even know? We'll never know for sure, but we do know this. They were here before history said they could be, and that's the kind of fact that doesn't just challenge a timeline, it haunts it. Western-stemmed versus Clovis. Let's say you're holding a stone point in your hand, finely shaped, lethally sharp, and far older than the state of Idaho itself. You turn it over, admiring the craftsmanship. To the trained eye, the fluting or lack of it matters. The base, the symmetry, the way the edges were struck. It tells you who made it, where they came from, and what they thought was important in the art of survival. Now imagine two such points side by side. One is a Clovis point, sleek, symmetrical, with that iconic flute down the middle, like a stylistic signature from a vanished world. The other is what archaeologists call a western-stemmed point, broader, stemmed at the base and shaped differently, almost like it came from a parallel world with different rules. The problem is, they show up around the same time. In some places, the stemmed points are even older. And nowhere is this contradiction more apparent than in Idaho. Here in the Intermountain West, you find western-stemmed projectile points scattered like breadcrumbs across ancient campsites, Wilson Butte, Buhl, Cooper's Ferry, and far beyond. They're everywhere, persistent, and stubbornly not Clovis, which leads to a mystery with more than academic stakes. Are we looking at two separate migrations into the Americas? Two distinct cultures living side by side? Or just one group who couldn't quite agree on how to sharpen a spear? This isn't just about rocks. This is about how humans arrived here, when, why, and by what route. The Clovis first model, for decades, held the intellectual throne. Clovis points, elegant and deadly, were supposedly the calling card of the first Americans entering from Siberia, walking across Beringia, and fanning out across a virgin continent in one big, glorious migration of megafauna hunting, mammoth-chasing pioneers. But Western-stemmed throws a wrench into the gears. These tools don't fit the Clovis mold. Their technology resembles points found in Asia and the Pacific Rim, not in eastern North America where Clovis first made its name. And then there's the geography. Clovis points tend to cluster in the Great Plains in the east. Western-stemmed points, as their name would suggest, dominate the Intermountain West, the volcanic badlands, flood-scoured basins, and high plains of Idaho, Oregon, Nevada. They're not rare. They're foundational. And at Cooper's Ferry, the plot thickens. That mysterious pre-Clovis site along the Salmon River, it has western-stemmed points, but not Clovis. Not a single one. It's as if Clovis never got the invitation. So scientists began to wonder, what if Clovis wasn't the first? What if the western-stemmed tradition, humble, less flashy, but older, was the real pioneer? And what if the Clovis story we told for decades was just the eastern chapter of a much messier, more complicated book? Enter the Paisley Caves in Oregon, just southwest of Idaho. There, archaeologists found western-stemmed points in direct association with human coprolites, yes, fossilized excrement dated to nearly 14,000 years ago. That's older than many classic Clovis sites. And yet, the Paisley people didn't seem to know or care about fluting. They had their own way of doing things. Which leads to the heart of the mystery. Were Clovis and Western stemmed two separate cultural lineages arriving at different times by different routes? Or were they branches of the same migratory tree, adapting regionally and creatively to different environments? The scientific jury is still out. DNA evidence is scarce. Tool traditions don't always map neatly onto populations. And while radiocarbon dates are getting better, they still offer more questions than answers. Some archaeologists propose a dual route model. Clovis entered through an interior ice-free corridor, while Western-stemmed groups came earlier, hugging the Pacific coastline perhaps by boat, perhaps on foot, island hopping along the kelp forests. In this telling, Idaho becomes the great meeting point, a continental handshake between different visions of technology, migration, and memory. Others say it's all one people, just evolving differently. Tool styles can change depending on terrain, material availability, or even something as human as fashion. Maybe stemmed points were better for fishing salmon in Idaho rivers. Maybe fluted Clovis points were optimized for hunting mammoths on the open plains. Maybe, just maybe, humans have always been creatively inconsistent. But then again, if it were just a matter of function or style, you might expect more overlap, more hybrid tools. Instead, what we see in the archaeological record, especially in places like Idaho, is a persistent separation. Western-stemmed people doing their own thing, in their own way, for thousands of years, like they didn't even know Clovis existed, or didn't care. Which brings us to the philosophical core of this conundrum. Maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe instead of, who was first, we should be asking, why were there different ways of being human at the edge of the world? Why do we always expect a single origin, a single story, a single way to discover a place? The past, like the people who lived it, refuses to be simple. And if Western-stemmed isn't a side note in the Clovis story, but a whole other chapter, we need to rethink not just how early humans spread across North America, but how many times they did so, and in how many different ways. Because once you open the door to parallel migrations, it stops being about which point is older and starts being about what else was happening here, quietly, before anyone bothered to write it down. Which leads to a figure buried in volcanic tuff near Buhl, Idaho. She's young, she's ancient, and she died with obsidian tools at her side, tools that weren't Clovis, weren't stemmed, and weren't easily explained. And the story she doesn't tell is even stranger than the one we think she does. If your brain's already spinning and we've only just scratched the surface, go ahead and subscribe for more stories that never settle. These mysteries don't end, they just echo. And since you're still here, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you in a desert at dawn? A city at 2 a.m.? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who else is up chasing ghosts in the dirt. The Buhl woman's story. Some stories don't begin with a discovery. They begin with an accident. In 1989, near the town of Buhl in south-central Idaho, workers at a commercial quarry were doing what quarry workers do, cutting through layers of basalt and sediment in search of valuable stone. What they found instead was a body. Not a recent one, not even remotely modern. It was the partial skeleton of a young woman around 17 to 21 years old, buried face down, tucked beneath a blanket of volcanic ash and geologic time. At first, she didn't even have a name, just an archaeological tag and a pile of questions. But over time, as the mystery refused to go away, she became known quietly, ambiguously, as the Buhl woman. And her presence in the landscape started to unravel yet another neat version of the past. She wasn't buried in a formal grave. There were no funerary artifacts in the traditional sense. But nearby, archaeologists found bone and stone tools, projectile points, obsidian flakes, the kinds of things you don't just stumble across unless someone meant to leave them there. Whether they were part of her toolkit or placed deliberately is still debated. The obsidian, once sourced, turned out to be from Bear Gulch, over 100 miles away. She died young, yes, but not violently. No major trauma, no signs of prolonged illness, just bones and silence. The kind of death that doesn't announce itself. The kind that slips quietly into the earth and waits for someone to notice. And then came the date, roughly 10,675 years before present. Older than the pyramids, older than the Clovis extinction, older than most of the known burials in North America. Suddenly, this was no longer a local curiosity. It was a continental anomaly. Because the Buhl woman's skeleton wasn't just old, it was one of the oldest relatively complete human remains ever found in the Americas. She was Paleo-Indian, a ghost from the terminal Pleistocene, a person who walked through a landscape still shivering from the last ice age. And then, the deeper questions started. Who was she? Where was her community? What kind of life did she live, and what does her death tell us about the people of early Idaho? Researchers began to analyze her bones. Her teeth showed signs of heavy wear, not from decay, but from use, possibly from grinding plant material or from working hides. Her stature was average for the time, about 5'2". Her build was solid. Her bones had done work. Stable isotope analysis hinted that she ate freshwater fish, possibly salmon, and wild plants, a forager's diet. But the specifics remained fuzzy. No fish bones at the site, no net weights or hooks. Just clues, scattered like pollen on the wind. DNA? Unfortunately, no usable ancient DNA has been recovered from her remains. Whether due to preservation conditions, contamination, or sheer bad luck, the genetic thread that might have connected her to modern indigenous populations has snapped, for now. So anthropologists turn to morphology, skull measurements, bone structure, comparative anatomy. The results were mixed. Some traits aligned with other early North American remains. Others seemed atypical. Some even sparked deeply problematic attempts to racialize her features, reviving tired arguments about who got to be called the first Americans. Indigenous groups, rightfully, weren't thrilled. The Shoshone-Bannock tribes, whose ancestral lands include the Buhl area, requested her return under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And after a lengthy debate, she was repatriated and reburied in 1993. Quietly, without cameras, without further study. That decision sparked academic controversy. Some argued that the Buhl woman could have yielded decades of valuable data about early human migration and lifeways. Others pointed out correctly that she wasn't an object. She was a person. A young woman who died before agriculture, before metallurgy, before the wheel, and somehow ended up as a scientific flashpoint 10 millennia later. But the core mystery remains untouched. Who buried her here, in this wind-scoured slice of basalt and sage? Why this place? Why alone? Was this the edge of her group's territory? A seasonal stop? A tragedy far from home? We don't know. And perhaps we never will. Because the more we study early Idaho, the more it resists tidy answers. The Buhl woman is a reminder that human presence in this region wasn't sparse, or marginal, or accidental. It was enduring. It was embedded. People knew these rivers, these stones, these migration routes. They traded obsidian across mountain ranges. They cooked Camas roots in pit ovens. They crossed lava fields in bare feet. And sometimes, they left behind someone they loved. If anything, her burial suggests care. Even if the grave wasn't marked, even if it lacked ceremony by modern standards, someone paused long enough to make sure she didn't simply lie exposed. That small act, lost to history, is one of the few things about her life we can say with certainty. But there's another layer to this story. Because if the Buhl woman represents a community, however faintly, then we have to ask, where else did they go? Where did they camp, hunt, cook, and carve? Where are their shelters, their middens, their stories? And that's where things get murkier. Because just a few hundred miles southeast, tucked into the volcanic scars of the Snake River Plain, there's a cave, dark, quiet, and layered with sediment. And in that cave, bones of extinct animals lie next to traces of ancient fire. It's called Wilson Butte, and it might be the next breadcrumb in this half-buried trail. Wilson Butte Cave's first visitors. In the high desert southeast of Twin Falls, Idaho, where the land yawns open into vast lava plains and sagebrush clings to blackened stone, there's a cave that doesn't look like much. A low basaltic shelter carved into the ancient flows of Wilson Butte. No welcome sign, no dramatic entrance, just a hollow in the rock, like the earth paused mid-sentence. But inside this unassuming cavity lies one of the longest human occupation records in the Pacific Northwest and one of its deepest mysteries. Wilson Butte Cave isn't the kind of place you stumble into. It's surrounded by ancient lava fields, craggy and unforgiving, laid down in violent outbursts some 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. And yet, humans came here, repeatedly, across centuries, across ages, across extinctions. The cave's story begins in the 1,950 seconds, when excavation teams started pulling back the layers. What they found startled nearly everyone. Tools, animal bones, fire-cracked rock, and most tantalizingly charcoal layers dated to as far back as 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Some radiocarbon estimates even suggested dates reaching into the 16,000, 17,000 year range, though these are still debated. If accurate, that would place Wilson Butte Cave among the oldest human-inhabited sites in the Americas. But the moment you try to pin that down, things get slippery. You see, the deeper layers of the cave are messy, not in the casual way a college apartment is messy, but in the geologic, stratigraphic way that makes archaeologists twitch. Animal burrows, sediment mixing, shifting ash layers. It's like time itself refused to cooperate. Every find is accompanied by a question mark. Still, the pieces accumulate. Stone tools, mostly basalt flakes, scrapers, grinding stones, charred seeds and bones, some burned bison remains. Even camel and mammoth bone species long gone by the time most textbooks say humans were supposed to be here. Were these animals alive when humans entered the cave? Or were their bones already ancient, disturbed by later visitors? The site doesn't say. But what it does suggest, unmistakably, is this. People kept coming back, over and over, across millennia. They lit fires here, they prepared food, they shaped tools. And they did it in the middle of a landscape that, to the modern eye, looks like punishment. A basaltic moonscape, dry and sharp and seismically quiet only on the surface. So why here? That question, repeated like a mantra across the Snake River Plain, echoes especially loud at Wilson Butte, because unlike coastal sites or river terraces, this cave isn't obviously strategic. It's not by a major water source. It's not easy to access. And yet, it was clearly meaningful. Perhaps it was a shelter in a pinch, a stopover in seasonal migration. Or maybe it was more. A lookout? A ceremonial site? A place encoded in the memory of movement where paths crossed, stories were told, and old knowledge was passed on beneath a stone ceiling. The cave also raises an uncomfortable question for archaeologists. If people were already here, in this cave, during or before the end of the last ice age, where are the others? Where are the camps, the trails, the tools between the coast and here? Did the first Americans move inland sooner than we thought? Or are we simply bad at finding their traces? Because if Wilson Butte Cave is genuine, if people were here more than 15,000 years ago, that pushes human occupation back to a time when glaciers still locked much of the continent in white silence. And yet Idaho, oddly enough, was open. The Intermountain West may have been a pocket of relative refuge, ice-free corridors, migrating megafauna, open basins, the kind of place someone might stop. Or stay. And there's something else in the shadows. When you descend into Wilson Butte Cave, There's a strange silence, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of deep time. The cave doesn't just hold objects, it holds layers of presence. You can almost feel the stratigraphy pushing back, a dozen occupations stacked like forgotten letters, written in charcoal and stone. And just above those deepest layers, those murky, contested hints of Pleistocene life, lie clearer records, arrowheads from the Archaic period, Fremont-style artifacts, even traces of Shoshone-Bannock presence, as if the cave remembered everyone who passed through, as if it refused to forget. But still, the big question haunts the site like a draft of cold air. Did people share this cave with extinct animals? Were humans here before the mammoths vanished? Or is this another case of stratigraphic mischief? Bones and fire pits from different centuries jumbled by rodents and roots. The scientists tried to settle it. They dug meticulously. They ran the radiocarbon dates, rechecked the layers, mapped the contours of charcoal flecks and basalt chips, but the verdict is still pending. Every conclusion seems to teeter just a bit. It's not the kind of certainty you can build a museum around. And maybe that's the point. Because Wilson Butte Cave is less a statement than a suggestion, a soft whisper that the story of early humans in Idaho didn't begin where we thought it did, and probably didn't follow the script we wrote for it. It's a threshold, a vestibule into something older, deeper, stranger. And it sets the stage for another Idaho site, not far from here, where the bones of not just one bison but hundreds lie stacked in chaotic, puzzling layers. Were they hunted, herded, driven, ritualized? At Owl Cave, the air is thick with questions, and the bones are piled far too high for any simple answer. Owl Cave's mass bison kills. If you drive east of American Falls and let the rolling wheat fields lull you into thinking Idaho is a simple place, you might miss the entrance to one of its oldest unsolved puzzles. Owl Cave doesn't announce itself. No looming cliffside, no ceremonial gate, just a weathered hollow set into the basalt, halfway between farmland and forgottenness. And yet, buried beneath this ordinary-looking rock shelter is something profoundly extraordinary. The dismembered remains of hundreds of bison, stacked in dense, chaotic bone beds, tangled, fragmented, and coated in the quiet dust of ages. How they got there? Still debated. Why they were killed here? Still unclear. Who did it, and what they were thinking? Anyone's guess. Let's set the scene. Owl Cave lies on the northern edge of the Snake River Plain, a region already known for its long human history and dramatic geologic past. Lava flows, glacial floods, and prehistoric lakes have carved it into a natural maze, one where travel, survival, and strategy had to be learned the hard way. Archaeologists began formal excavation of Owl Cave in the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds. What they found inside stopped them cold. Not a few bison bones scattered about, but layer upon layer of mass bison remained skulls, ribs, long bones interspersed with stone tools, broken projectile points, and fire-cracked rocks. In some layers, the density of bones was so extreme, it was as if entire herds had fallen from the sky. But of course, they didn't fall. Something, or someone, brought them here. The current hypothesis, tentative, though compelling, is that Owl Cave was used for communal bison drives. That's the practice of corralling, chasing, or herding large numbers of bison toward a kill zone, often a natural trap, cliff, or enclosed basin. Other parts of North America, especially the Great Plains, are full of such kill sites. But in Idaho, not so much. An Owl Cave is different. There's no clear cliff to drive animals off, no constructed corral, just a shallow basalt depression. The topography alone doesn't scream trap, and yet the bone evidence suggests mass kills, not individual hunts. That implies strategy, repetition, coordination, and a kind of seasonal predictability that speaks to deep ecological knowledge. Some of the bison remains at Owl Cave have been radiocarbon dated to the early Holocene roughly 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. That's shortly after the Ice Age ended, when the megafauna were disappearing and human foragers were adapting to a rapidly changing climate, but other bones may be older still. The layers are complex, and like Wilson Butte Cave, the stratigraphy doesn't always behave. So what were people doing here? The pattern suggests repeated use. Not a one-time slaughter, but a ritualized return year after year, maybe generation after generation, to hunt bison en masse in this specific location. Why here? Why this cave? The land around it is open, but not especially unique. The cave itself offers shelter, but it's not vast. The answer may lie in invisible patterns, migration corridors, wind channels, the subtle art of funneling prey without fences. But even if the kill site theory holds, the story remains incomplete. Because these weren't just butchering sites. Alongside the bones are human tools, scrapers, hammerstones, projectile points. Some show signs of use wear. Others appear freshly broken, maybe during the chaos of the hunt. Fire pits suggest cooking, but again, not all in one layer. The bison bones and human artifacts seem to intermingle, as if the cave was a witness to many events, not just one. And then there's the question of scale. How many people would it take to pull off a bison drive of this magnitude? A small family group couldn't do it. You'd need coordination, maybe 20, 30, or more people working together. That implies social structure, planning, roles. Not just for the hunt, but for processing the aftermath. Meat, hides, bones. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be. But perhaps the most intriguing mystery is this. How did they learn to do it? Bison drives require intimate understanding of herd behavior. You need to know when they migrate, how they react to threats, how terrain influences movement. You don't just wake up and decide to kill 50 animals at once. It's a learned tradition passed down through trial, error, and cultural memory. And yet we still don't know how old this tradition was in Idaho. Owl Cave might represent its beginning or a middle chapter we've happened to find. Some scientists have floated alternative explanations. Perhaps the bison died in a natural disaster, or were trapped by a freak weather event. But the presence of tools, cut marks, and fire-cracked rock argues otherwise. Someone was here, someone planned this, and someone came back for more. What we're left with is a site that doesn't explain itself. It just offers evidence, bones, tools, ash, and silence. Even today, Owl Cave doesn't yield its secrets easily. Much of it remains unexcavated, partly due to funding, partly due to the sheer logistical complexity of sorting through tens of thousands of fragmented bones. But perhaps partly because no one's quite sure what they'll find next, and that hesitation might be earned. Because just downstream from Owl Cave lies a massive rock covered in ancient carvings. A stone so dense with symbols, it looks less like artwork and more like a map. But of what? That's the riddle of map rock, an alleged chart, a celestial guide, or maybe just the earliest unsolvable puzzle carved into stone. Either way, it's not done confusing us. Map rock map of what? It sits quietly on a bluff above the Snake River, sun-bleached and battered by time. To the casual eye, map rock is just another boulder, among many a large chunk of volcanic basalt marooned on a windswept slope southwest of Boise. But take a closer look, and you'll notice something strange. The rock is covered absolutely saturated with petroglyphs. Winding lines, spirals, hatch marks, human-like figures, and shapes that resemble rivers, mountains, or perhaps nothing at all. Carved with patience, stone on stone, by people whose names we'll never know, for purposes we still don't understand. The first modern accounts of map rock date back to the 1,800 seconds, when early settlers and surveyors stumbled across it and, unsurprisingly, decided it looked like a map. A map of what, exactly? No one agreed. Some saw river courses, others saw star patterns. Still others believed it depicted migratory routes, tribal territories, or hunting grounds. Over a century later, the mystery remains delightfully, maddeningly intact. Map Rock is part of a much larger cluster of petroglyphs found across southwestern Idaho. Dozens of boulders, scattered across the landscape like a forgotten library of stone, bear similar markings, sometimes isolated, sometimes in dense panels. But Map Rock stands out for its sheer complexity. It's not a few doodles etched out during a long winter. It's a commitment, a visual system, maybe even a language. And therein lies the problem. We don't know how to read it. Interpreting petroglyphs is a notoriously fraught business. You can't date the carvings directly because stone doesn't contain carbon. You can estimate based on weathering, patination, and the archaeological context of nearby sites, but those are slippery metrics. So scholars are left trying to triangulate meaning from stylistic comparisons, ethnographic records, and informed guesswork. The best current estimates place some of the carvings at Map Rock between 500 and 10,000 years old. That's quite the range, long enough for entire civilizations to rise, collapse, and be forgotten. The symbols themselves resemble styles associated with ancestral northern Shoshone and Paiute groups, but also bear similarities to far older traditions across the Columbia Plateau and Great Basin. In short, the rock is old, really old, and its message has outlived its messengers. So, is it actually a map? Some believe so. A handful of researchers have tried to align the petroglyphs with known topographic features in the surrounding region. There's a particular squiggly line that may represent the Snake River. Another series of etched curves could be canyons or creeks. A dot might mark a seasonal camp, a hot spring, or a sacred site. It's tempting, certainly, to match symbol with landform to impose cartographic logic on ancient abstraction. But here's the catch. It's equally possible that the lines are metaphorical. Perhaps they charted spiritual journeys instead of geographic ones. Maybe the symbols record oral histories, migration myths, or celestial cycles. Perhaps each figure encoded a story or ceremony, remembered and retold as generations gathered at the stone. In this interpretation, Map Rock is less of a GPS and more of a stage where stories were performed, not explained. And yet, the map theory refuses to die. Partly because the petroglyphs do evoke something spatial, interconnected, flowing, layered. Partly because we want to believe we can decode them. And partly because, in a poetic twist, the rock is now surrounded by modern cartography, roads, survey lines, GPS markers. Everyone has a map now, except the people who first carved one into basalt. But maybe that's the real puzzle. Maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Why assume that map means geography at all? What if the rock is mapping relationships between people, animals, seasons, ancestors? What if it's a mnemonic device for stories too complex to tell in words alone? What if the spirals are memories? What if the dots are names? Or perhaps the carvings served no practical purpose. Maybe they were acts of beauty, of devotion, of defiance. Carving into stone is not efficient. It's not impulsive. It takes time, patience, and a kind of long-range thinking modern culture rarely indulges. Whoever made Map Rock believed it would last, that someone, somewhen would see it. Well, we've seen it, and we still don't understand it. That hasn't stopped tourists from visiting, or scholars from debating, or storytellers from speculating. The Bureau of Land Management has even installed a helpful sign nearby, offering interpretations while acknowledging, politely, that we have absolutely no idea what we're looking at, which is, in its own way, the perfect summary of Idaho's deep-time archaeological record. We find these things, points, bones, carvings, ashes, and we draw lines between them, hoping the pattern will reveal itself. Sometimes it does, More often, it doesn't. And we're left with beautiful confusion carved into rock, echoing across millennia. But map rock doesn't stand alone. Just downriver, where the snake curls around ancient basalt boulders flung by prehistoric floods, you'll find another site. It's full of petroglyphs too, carved into flood-scoured stones. The time range is even broader, the style even more cryptic. And while map rock might be a map, the carvings at Celebration Park feel more like messages. The only problem? We still don't know who wrote them or how long ago they started. Celebration Park, Petroglyphs. Drive far enough out of Boise, trade the strip malls and subdivisions for open sky and volcanic stone, and you'll eventually reach the Snake River. But not just any stretch. This is Celebration Park, Idaho's only official archaeological park, and a place where the past has a peculiar way of refusing to stay buried. Instead, it rises from the earth, in the form of stone carvings, thousands of them etched across enormous basalt boulders, like ancient graffiti on the ruins of a forgotten world. At first glance, the place feels oddly theatrical. Massive black rocks scattered across a broad floodplain, their surfaces marked with spirals, grids, and humanoid figures. The kind of shapes that seem like they might mean something until you try to assign them a meaning. And that's the central issue. No one knows exactly who carved them, or when, or why. The estimates vary wildly. Some petroglyphs here might be as young as a few hundred years old, linked to historic Shoshone-Bannock ancestors. Others could date back over 10,000 years, making them some of the oldest surviving marks left by human hands anywhere in North America. The styles are inconsistent. The weathering patterns are uneven. Some panels are deeply carved and precise. Others are faint, as if whispered onto the stone. That staggering time span, 10 millennia, give or take, creates a problem, not just of dating, but of context. It's entirely possible that different people, from different cultures, at different times, all carved here. Which means, what you're seeing isn't one story carved across the landscape, but many, layered and colliding like tectonic plates of memory. And the rocks themselves? They didn't start here. Most of the boulders bearing carvings at Celebration Park were flung across the land by the Bonneville flood, one of the largest and most catastrophic megafloods in Earth's history. Some 14,500 years ago, glacial Lake Bonneville, an enormous prehistoric lake that once covered much of Utah, burst its natural dam at Red Rock Pass. The result was a flood of unimaginable scale, hurtling down the Snake River at speeds over 70 miles per hour, scouring everything in its path. When the floodwaters hit this stretch of the river, they slammed into a basalt plateau, tearing away massive slabs of rock and scattering them like dice. The surface was reshaped overnight, leaving behind what geologists call a boulder bar and what archaeologists now call a petroglyph field. It's one of the great cosmic ironies. A disaster rearranged the landscape just right to create the perfect canvas for human expression. So, what do the carvings say? That depends entirely on who you ask. Some researchers classify the petroglyphs into broad stylistic categories: Great Basin, Abstract, Columbia, Plateau Figurative, etc., and try to trace cultural lineages. Others look for motifs, shamanic figures, hunting scenes, celestial symbols. There are spirals that might track the sun, ladders that might mean journeys, animals, humans, tracks, and shapes that defy even speculative interpretation. But ultimately, all of these are guesses, and the guesses often reflect more about us modern viewers than about the people who made the carvings. We want them to be messages, maps, myths. We want a key that decodes the entire rock face, a Rosetta Stone of ancient Idaho. But what if that's not how it works? What if some carvings were personal, or playful, or made by someone with no intention of being understood? Maybe that spiral was someone's name. Maybe that stick figure with outstretched arms was just a teenager carving a version of "I was here 6,000 years before spray paint." Or maybe, just maybe, it was sacred, not meant for our eyes at all. Then there's the material reality. Carving into basalt isn't easy. It takes time, effort, and tools. Pecking, grinding, repeating. These weren't casual acts. The carvings reflect intention, even if the meaning is lost. Someone took the time to say something, to mark something, to preserve something without words, without explanation, and without expecting future readers. Which brings us to the most humbling possibility of all. Maybe we were never meant to understand them. Celebration Park isn't a book. It's a palimpsest, a layered record where old marks blur under new ones, where meaning is cumulative rather than clear. Trying to solve it is like trying to solve a campfire story you only heard the middle of, told in a language that no longer exists. And yet, it draws people, hikers, archaeologists, school kids, elders, skeptics. Everyone wants to know, who were they, what were they saying, and why here? The park's name, Celebration, might be the most ironic part. There's no proof it was ever a place of celebration. It could have been sacred, or solemn, or seasonal, or transitional, or none of those things, but it leaves an impression that is hard to shake. Because when you walk among the boulders, there's a strange sense of continuity, as if the people who carved these shapes were just here yesterday, as if they're still here, in the cracks and dust, in the burn of the basalt under the sun. And just beyond the park, the Petroglyph Trail doesn't end. Head into the hills near Camas and Pole Creeks, and you'll find an entire prehistoric district, camps, rock alignments, tool workshops, and yet more carvings stretching across miles of Idaho wilderness. But this time, it's not just the symbols that are unexplained. It's the entire landscape. Camas and Pole Creeks, rock art and camps. Out in the high, wind-cut plateaus of south-central Idaho, where the land begins to rise toward the Sawtooth Range and the basalt gives way to stretches of sagebrush, something strange happens to the horizon. It flattens, but not into emptiness. Instead, it opens like a canvas, wide, quiet, and marked with signs that shouldn't be there. Rock alignments, circles of stone, shards of obsidian, a fire-blackened stone oven here, a faint petroglyph there, patterns too intentional to be natural, too ancient to be casual. This is the Camas and Pole Creeks Archaeological District, one of Idaho's least understood and most quietly provocative prehistoric landscapes. Stretching across a broad swath of upland terrain, this area contains hundreds of features that hint at a deep and complex human presence spanning thousands of years. And yet, the full story, what all of it meant, and to whom is still out of reach. Start with the geography. Camas Prairie itself is a wide, high valley ringed by hills and fed by seasonal streams. In spring and early summer, it bursts into bloom with camas, lilies, a brilliant carpet of blue, but more importantly, a critical food source. Indigenous peoples across the plateau region relied on camas bulbs as a dietary staple, particularly women, who managed, harvested, and baked them in pit ovens passed down across generations. The region takes its name from the plant, but it holds much more than roots. Scattered across the Camas and Pole Creek basins are dozens, perhaps hundreds of archaeological features, stone circles that might be the remains of ancient dwellings or storage pits, long rock alignments, possibly used for hunting drives, navigation, or ritual, and petroglyphs of varying styles and depths etched onto basalt outcrops with no clear order. The area is massive and difficult to survey. Some of the camps and alignments are buried beneath layers of silt or masked by seasonal grasses. Others are perched on ridgelines or nestled into coulees, visible only to those who already know where to look, and even when you find them, they don't come with instructions. Who made them? When? For how long? The answers, as always in Idaho prehistory, are somewhere between incomplete and unknowable. What archaeologists do know is that this region likely saw repeated, seasonal use for thousands of years. People didn't live here year-round. Winters are brutal, the water inconsistent, but they came back again and again, probably in the warmer months. The Camas harvest alone could have justified the trip. Baked underground in rock-lined ovens, the bulbs transform into a sweet, starchy food that stores well and sustains for months. But there was more to the story than sustenance. The distribution of features suggests multifunctional use. Some areas may have been seasonal campsites, others were likely specialized activity zones, tool-making, food processing, rituals. Some of the rock alignments seem to follow ridgelines or slope edges in ways that suggest game drives corridors used to funnel deer or antelope into kill zones. But again, this is theory, not certainty. And then there's the rock art. Unlike the dense, symbolic fields of Map Rock or Celebration Park, the petroglyphs here are more scattered, often isolated, sometimes single figures, sometimes small clusters, a spiral on a high outcrop, a set of parallel lines etched just above a seasonal spring, a humanoid shape, arms outstretched, pecked into a stone that no one would notice unless they were standing at just the right angle, in just the right light. Some of these petroglyphs have been tentatively dated to at least several thousand years old, but, as always, direct dating is elusive. The style is consistent with the Columbia Plateau tradition shared across much of the inland Northwest, but the meanings remain site-specific. These weren't decorations, they were messages. The problem is, we no longer speak the language. There's also a strange chronological layering at play. Some features appear archaic stone circles and alignments weathered nearly smooth. Others, like certain hearths and chipped obsidian scatters, might be only a few hundred years old. In the absence of stratified, datable deposits, archaeologists are left to infer time through weathering, tool style, and landscape context. And even that has limits. For all we know, some of these features could have been reused or reinterpreted by different groups across generations, much like a trail that becomes a road, or a house that becomes a shrine. Memory lingers in the land, but not always legibly. To walk through Camas and Pole Creeks is to feel that ambiguity in real time. You know someone lived here, not just visited, but planned, adapted, remembered. They used the same routes, knew the springs, harvested the same patches of camas, repaired the same ovens, year after year, but they also left room for silence. Maybe that was intentional. Maybe these places weren't just for living, but for listening, watching the seasons shift, marking time, passing knowledge in a way that doesn't survive translation. And so, once again, the modern visitor is left with more structure than story. A ring of stones, a stretch of basalt with faint carvings, a pattern of rocks you almost walk past before realizing they don't belong there by chance. It's a pattern we keep seeing across Idaho. People left traces, campfires, carvings, tools, but not answers. Not the kind we want, anyway. And just like that, the mystery expands. Because in the rivers near these upland camps, archaeologists have found net sinkers, weirs, and fishing gear. Stone fishing technology, widespread, practical, ingenious. But no one knows quite how early it began, or how quickly it spread. Stone fishing. How early? Somewhere in the rippling shallows of an ancient Idaho river, a flat rock lies buried in silt. A groove runs across one side clearly shaped, unmistakably deliberate. It fits in the palm just right. Too smooth, too symmetric to be random. It's a net sinker stone technology for catching fish, crafted by hands no one remembers, used in a system that may have fed entire communities. And yet, no one knows just how long this stone has been doing its quiet work. Across the Pacific Northwest, the use of stone fishing tools is well documented. Grooved sinkers, cobble net weights, and small anchors have been recovered from dozens of archaeological sites along rivers, lakes, and coastlines. They're not glamorous artifacts, no ceremonial flair. No artistic carvings, but they are functional, which makes them far more revealing in their own understated way. In Idaho, they begin to appear in archaeological records with increasing regularity during the mid to late Holocene, say, around 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. But the question isn't whether ancient peoples fished. That's a given. The real mystery is how early they began using this kind of systematic stone fishing technology and how those practices developed over time. Because here's the twist. Some Idaho sites suggest stone fishing tools may have been in use much earlier, possibly during the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, when the climate was shifting, megafauna were disappearing, and people were redefining what it meant to live off the land. But the evidence is scattered, fragmentary, and frustratingly hard to pin down. Take the Clearwater River Basin, for example. One of the most salmon-rich regions in the interior Northwest, it has supported human life for thousands of years. At several sites along its banks, archaeologists have uncovered grooved stones, likely net sinkers alongside other food processing tools. Many are undated. Some are associated with early occupation layers that suggest deep antiquity, but without solid stratigraphy or secure radiocarbon contexts, the debate lingers. Were these tools really from the earliest inhabitants, or from later groups who dug into older deposits? Then there's the Columbia Plateau, extending into western Idaho, where evidence of early fishing technologies becomes a tangle of possibility. Some net sinkers found in riverine contexts are associated with Windust phase materials, one of the earliest cultural phases in the region, dating back over 10,000 years. But again, the associations are loose. The items may have moved. The sediments may have shifted. The rivers themselves may have altered course, dragging artifacts miles from where they were first used. Even in more secure contexts, the functionality of the stones isn't always clear. A grooved cobble might be a net sinker, or it might be a weight for a drying rack, or a tool for stretching hides. Function is inferred, not confirmed. And for the early periods before written records, before oral traditions were documented, guesswork is the only tool sharper than the stone itself. The broader question is one of adaptation. Fishing, especially with net systems, is not a casual behavior. It requires planning, investment, shared labor. You need materials, cordage, stone weights, wooden frames. You need seasonal knowledge when the fish will arrive, how long they'll stay, which tributaries they'll run up, and which they'll avoid. You also need to store and process the fish, which leads to infrastructure, smoke pits, drying racks, cutting tools. So, when we find a grooved stone in an early layer, we're not just asking when people started fishing, we're asking when they began engineering their landscape to make it happen. And if it turns out they were doing this 10,000 years ago, or earlier, that reframes much of what we thought we knew about Paleo-Indian lifeways. Because, for a long time, the dominant image of early North American inhabitants, especially those west of the Rockies, was that of big game hunters chasing extinct species across open plains. But if people in Idaho were investing in salmon runs, building net systems, and passing down that knowledge across generations, then the story is far more nuanced. They weren't just surviving. They were thriving, strategically, seasonally, sustainably, and Idaho's river systems would have been ideal for it. The Snake, the Salmon, the Clearwater, these were arteries of abundance, pulsing with trout, sturgeon, and salmon that returned year after year. Predictable, generous, essential. And all you needed to tap into that abundance was a little stone, a groove carved just so, and a net built to catch a season's worth of life. Yet we still don't know exactly when those grooves first appeared. Some researchers now think that our inability to find earlier fishing tools has less to do with absence and more to do with preservation bias. Organic nets and wooden fish traps rot quickly, riverbanks erode, floodplains shift, tools end up downstream, buried, broken, or mistaken for natural stone. For every net sinker we find, 100 may have vanished. And as radiocarbon methods improve, and as indigenous knowledge continues to inform archaeological interpretations, we may find that Idaho's fishing traditions go deeper than anyone expected. Until then, we're left staring at a grooved stone and asking it to speak. But even if it never does, it leaves a mark, a hint, a possibility. And that's enough to turn our attention upstream to the massive, ancient lake that once filled Idaho's western valleys. Lake Idaho, an inland sea that eventually vanished. But not in the way you think. Lake Idaho's grand exit. Before there was the Snake River Plain as we know it, before the wind-carved canyons, the flood-scoured basalt, or the lava fields that stretch out like broken promises, there was water, a lot of it. Imagine a lake so vast it stretched across western Idaho for millions of years. A lake that flooded valleys, lapped at the base of what would become mountains, and hosted ecosystems long extinct. This was Lake Idaho, not a glacial lake like Bonneville or Missoula, but a warm, persistent, Pliocene inland sea that filled the western Snake River Basin for the better part of 5 million years. And then, at some point, no one can say quite when it left. Not all at once, not in a cinematic flood, but gradually, perhaps abruptly in bursts. Its departure reshaped southern Idaho forever. And the details of how, when, and why Lake Idaho drained remain among the most fundamental mysteries in the state's deep geologic history. The scientific term for what happened is basin integration, a polite phrase for something earth-shattering. At some point during the late Pliocene or early Pleistocene, Lake Idaho lost its internal drainage and became part of the broader Columbia River system. That is, it found an exit. Before that, it was what geologists call a closed basin. Water flowed in but had nowhere to go. Over time, sediments piled up, animals thrived and died, shorelines expanded and contracted with the climate. It was a stable, if temporary, world, and then it was gone. The leading theory is that tectonic and erosional forces, possibly a combination of volcanic uplift and drainage capture, carved a path through the western edge of the lake's natural dam. The first breach might have been subtle, like a trickle over the edge of a bathtub, or it might have been sudden and catastrophic, but once that water started flowing out, it never stopped. The lake drained. Not completely, but dramatically. The expansive, sluggish body of water shrank, split, and eventually disappeared from the map. In its place, canyons, basalt terraces, and the Snake River's current sinuous path. And this wasn't just a geologic event. It was an ecological reset button. Lake Idaho had supported warm water species, freshwater mollusks, fish, amphibians, many of which went extinct or retreated as the environment changed. Fossil beds in the area, especially near Hagerman, contain astonishing records of this lost world. Turtles, garfish, salamanders, and most famously, the Hagerman horse, a zebra-like equid that once grazed lake margins and has since become Idaho's state fossil. But once the lake drained, the climate shifted. The ecosystems collapsed and reformed. What had been a wetland paradise became a landscape of wind, basalt, and fire. And humans? They arrived much later, but by the time they set foot on the Snake River Plain, they were walking across a transformed world shaped in ways they would never fully understand. The scars of Lake Idaho's departure were etched into the terrain, coulees, terraces, gravels. In some places, entire fossil beds were preserved beneath volcanic ash or caught in layers of ancient sediment, silent witnesses to a world no longer visible. So why does this matter? Because the story of Lake Idaho isn't just a story about geology. It's a story about change, slow, unpredictable, irreversible change, and it complicates our assumptions about stability in the past. We tend to think of landscapes as backdrop static, unchanging settings where human stories unfold. But the land has a story too, and sometimes it swallows the script. The question that still haunts geologists is not whether Lake Idaho drained. We know that it did, but exactly how and when it joined the Snake-Columbia drainage network. Some models suggest integration happened around 2.5 to 2.0 million years ago, coinciding with the early stages of Snake River Canyon incision. Others argue for a more staggered process, with different basins integrating at different times through a series of water piracy events, where streams cut across divides and steal flow from adjacent basins. This isn't just a theoretical debate. The details affect everything downstream literally. The timing of integration affects sediment, transport, aquifer formation, flood potential, and even modern land use. It also intersects with other geologic events, like volcanism on the eastern Snake River Plain, which may have influenced or been influenced by changes in drainage patterns. And yet, even with advanced tools, satellite imagery, radiometric dating, core samples, the picture remains incomplete. The evidence is buried, broken, or locked inside stone. We know the lake was there. We know it left. But the in-between? Still a blank page. Which brings us to a poetic paradox. The thing that gave life to this part of Idaho for millions of years vanished without a clear goodbye, and now we spend decades trying to reconstruct the silence it left behind. But maybe that's the lesson. The deepest changes don't come with explanations, just consequences. And as Lake Idaho faded into history, it made room for another geological marvel, the carving of Hell's Canyon, North America's deepest gorge. A place so dramatic, so sudden in its incision, it begs a different question. What kind of river tears through a continent with that much force, and what exactly triggered it to do so? The birth of Hell's Canyon. Hell's Canyon is a place that does not ask for your attention, it demands it. Towering more than 7,900 feet from river to rim, it's the deepest gorge in North America. Deeper than the Grand Canyon, steeper than most mountain passes, and lonelier than any tourist brochure admits. Stretching over 10 miles wide and 100 miles long along the Idaho-Oregon border, it looks like a wound in the earth, one carved not by man, but by something with more patience and a far worse temper. At the bottom runs the Snake River, fast, cold, and relentless. It didn't always flow this way. Once upon a geologic time, it meandered slow and lazy through a more forgiving landscape. And then something changed. The canyon arrived, and scientists are still arguing over what exactly happened. The current leading theory is this. Around 2.1 million years ago, something triggered the Snake River to incise dramatically through the layered basalt and granite that now define Hell's Canyon. Before that, the river wasn't where it is now. In fact, the drainage systems of this region between the ancient volcanic flows of the Columbia Plateau and the rising edge of the Rocky Mountains were radically different. The Snake flowed north, then west, then it turned. And in doing so, it found a weak spot in the basalt, a fault line, a pressure point, and it dug. Not politely, not slowly, but fast. In geologic terms, violently. Some researchers believe this was the result of drainage capture, a process where one river overtakes another, stealing its flow, dramatically increasing volume and cutting power. The Snake, they argue, captured headwaters that once drained into Lake Idaho and the surrounding basins. Once the outlet dropped in elevation, gravity did the rest. The river accelerated, erosion intensified, and a canyon began to take shape. But not just any canyon. The magnitude of incision up to 1,500 feet per million years in some segments is unusually high. That rate of downcutting suggests more than just steady erosion. Something supercharged the process. Some geologists point to Pleistocene uplift of the Idaho batholith and the surrounding terrain. As the landscape rose, the river responded by carving deeper to maintain its gradient. Others emphasize the role of base-level change, as the Snake's new connection to the Columbia River system lowered its base level. The river had no choice but to dig down fast. And then there's the volcanic context. Much of the bedrock in Hell's Canyon consists of layered flows from the Columbia River basalt group, massive eruptions from the Miocene epoch that blanketed the region in thousands of feet of basalt. When rivers carve through this stuff, they do so erratically. Some layers are tough, others brittle. The result is a chaotic incision, with sheer cliffs, hanging tributaries, and bench-like formations that defy normal fluvial models. But even with all of this, the uplift, the capture, the volcanism, the birth of Hell's Canyon still feels like a geological overreaction. Why this much canyon? Why here? One clue lies in the debris. In certain caves and terraces within the canyon, scientists have found gravel deposits, ancient sediments left behind by the river before and during its great incision. These gravels tell a story of fluctuation, pulses of sediment, shifts in flow direction, even possible outburst floods. In other words, the canyon may not have been carved in a single steady event. It may have roared into existence, piece by piece, in phases some catastrophic, some creeping. And through it all, the snake kept going, relentless, adaptable. Today, the canyon is not just a geologic feature. It's a boundary, a liminal space between ecosystems, time periods, and cultural histories. Indigenous groups like the Nez Perce, Shoshone Bannock, and others have long told stories of the canyon. Some see it as a place of emergence, others as a passageway, a divide that is also a bridge. Modern scientists see it as a record, a stratified archive of fire, water, and upheaval. But for all our LiDAR scans, isotope analyses, and elevation models, one simple question remains unanswered. Why here and not somewhere else? The clues don't line up cleanly. The timing is still debated. And perhaps most frustrating of all, Hell's Canyon doesn't behave like a canyon carved solely by water. Its walls are too steep. Its incision too focused. Some researchers have proposed auxiliary forces, seismic activity, differential erosion, even glacial influence, far upstream, nudging the river toward extremes. But the data, as usual in Idaho, offers suggestion, not clarity. So we're left with a gorge deeper than logic, cut by a river that refused to be reasonable, and a landscape rearranged by a process we still can't fully explain. And yet the snake kept carving not just here, but across the entire plain. Further south, not far from where the river exits the canyon and winds into quieter land, there's another formation, a box-shaped scar in the basalt. Its head wall is massive, its origins, murky. Some say it was a megaflood. Others say it was groundwater bursting out like a geological ambush. Whatever the cause, Box Canyon doesn't fit the pattern. Which, of course, is exactly the pattern. Box Canyon's amphitheater head. From above, Box Canyon looks like a mistake in the landscape. A deep, sharply defined gash carved into the lava plains of southern Idaho's Snake River Plain, ending in a dramatic amphitheater head that seems to have been scooped out by something large, sudden, and not especially gentle. It's not a canyon in the classic, winding sense. It's short, steep, and bizarrely boxy. Less a slow act of erosion and more a scar that appeared all at once. And like so many features on this volcanic plain, it raises an irritatingly persistent question. How did this get here? To the east, the mouth of the canyon spills from a nearly vertical head wall, an enormous cliff of exposed basalt, nearly 100 feet tall. Below it, clear water gushes from the canyon floor in a powerful spring fed by the vast eastern Snake River Plain aquifer. It's so clean and cold, it supplies water directly to nearby fish hatcheries. The canyon floor is littered with basalt boulders and tumbled debris, and its sides are so geometrically abrupt that they almost look engineered. This is not a landscape of patience. Something happened here and quickly. Theories have circulated for decades, but only recently have scientists begun to converge on a deeply unsettling possibility. Box Canyon may have formed not over thousands of years, but in a matter of days, The evidence comes from a surprising source: experimental geomorphology. That is, scientists recreated a mini version of Box Canyon in a laboratory to test how water interacts with fractured basalt. The results? Under the right conditions, with enough pressure and enough flow, a canyon like this could be carved in less than a week. Let that sink in. This isn't your textbook model of river erosion. It's not slow sediment abrasion over millennia. It's hydraulic violence. It's groundwater sapping, a process where pressurized groundwater, stored beneath lava plains, bursts through a weak point in the rock and begins to undermine the cliff from within. As the water emerges, it tears out chunks of basalt, carving a vertical head that migrates backward as the canyon grows. This kind of formation is rare, but it matches what we see at Box Canyon: a steep amphitheater head, a powerful spring issuing from the base, and little evidence of a meandering river upstream to have done the carving. In other words, the river didn't cut the canyon. The spring did. Or at least, that's what one camp argues. Others point to a more catastrophic explanation: a megaflood. After all, this is Idaho, home to some of the most violent floods in geologic history. The Bonneville flood, which tore through the region roughly 14,500 years ago, left behind colossal ripple marks, scoured channels, and massive boulder bars across the Snake River system. Some researchers believe Box Canyon may have been carved or at least initiated by a Jokulhlop-style flood, where water from a glacial or pluvial lake was suddenly released and surged across the landscape. The shape of the canyon, its abrupt edges, and the large debris within it are consistent with flood features seen in other parts of the Pacific Northwest. But here's the twist: it might not be an either divided by or situation. The current working theory is a hybrid model, a 1-to-2 punch of catastrophic flooding and sustained groundwater sapping. The flood may have initiated the head cut, weakening the basalt and creating a fracture point. Then, over time, pressurized groundwater exploited the weakness, continuing to erode the head wall from within, ultimately forming the massive amphitheater we see today. This dual process model would explain the strange contradictions: the speed of formation, the geometry, the lack of a sizable river channel feeding the canyon, and the presence of one of Idaho's largest springs at its source. But even this theory isn't airtight. For one thing, the precise timing remains uncertain. Was Box Canyon formed during the Bonneville flood? Before it? After it? How long did the erosional process take? Are we talking weeks, months, centuries? The radiocarbon and geomorphic evidence is murky. There's no clear layer of flood sediment, and the spring doesn't carry sediment at a volume that would indicate ongoing erosion today. The canyon, it seems, was carved in a window of intensity and then froze in place. The broader mystery is what Box Canyon tells us about Idaho's hydrology. The eastern Snake River Plain aquifer is one of the largest in the country, holding as much as 200 million acre-feet of water moving beneath the surface through porous basalt layers. That water doesn't just trickle, it can surge, and when it does, it reshapes the land with little warning. Box Canyon is a monument to that hidden power. Not a river carving its way through stone, but water under the stone, waiting for a chance to escape. It suggests a landscape more volatile than it appears, a place where silence hides force and stillness masks instability. And perhaps most disturbingly, Box Canyon isn't unique. Just upstream, another canyon bears similar traits: steep walls, erratic debris, missing river sources. It's called Mallard Gorge, and it takes the flood versus spring debate to a whole new level. Because there, the canyon is even bigger, and the question of how much was carved by cataclysm versus calm remains entirely unresolved. Mallard Gorge's big bite. If Box Canyon is a scar, then Mallard Gorge is a bite mark, one so large and so surgically precise, it seems more like the work of a cosmic excavator than the slow, patient forces of nature. Located just east of Hagerman, Idaho, near the same Snake River corridor that has already raised too many geological eyebrows, Mallard Gorge is a deep, narrow canyon carved into black basalt. It stretches more than 2.5 miles long, drops nearly 250 feet deep in places, and presents a vertical spectacle that feels too sharp, too sudden, too clean to have happened on its own. It is a gorge that defies easy explanation. Water, of course, still flows through it, the Malad River, a tributary of the Snake. But here's the first red flag. The river seems underfit for the canyon it occupies. It trickles modestly through a corridor that looks built for something much, much bigger. It's like watching a garden hose run through a freeway tunnel. And this discrepancy opens the door to Idaho's favorite geologic parlor game. Was it groundwater or a flood? Let's rewind the tape. Much like Box Canyon, Malad Gorge slices through the Snake River plains, thick sequences of Columbia River basalt layered lava flows laid down during the Miocene epoch more than 10 million years ago. These basalt sheets are hard, brittle, and full of vertical cracks and lava tubes that make them behave strangely under erosion. They resist, and then they collapse. They absorb pressure, and then they explode, which makes any canyon carved into them inherently suspect. Geologists first assumed that the gorge was the work of the Malad River itself, a classic case of long-term fluvial incision. Water flows, sediment scrapes, rocks tumble, the canyon grows, nice and tidy. But the numbers didn't add up. The volume of water in the Malad isn't high enough to produce the kind of vertical walls and steep gradients seen in the gorge. And if it was carved slowly, where's the expected sediment pileup at the base? Where are the meanders? Where's the standard story? None of it shows up. Instead, the walls are abrupt, the floor is littered with massive boulders, and near the head of the canyon, there's a dramatic amphitheater collapse, eerily similar to the one at Box Canyon. This has led many researchers to propose a more dramatic origin, a high-energy megaflood, possibly the Bonneville flood. That flood, unleashed roughly 14,500 years ago when glacial Lake Bonneville breached its natural dam at Red Rock Pass, sent a wall of water barreling through southern Idaho. At its peak, it carried 10 times the flow of all the world's rivers combined. It was loud, fast, and unforgiving, ripping up sediment, shattering rock, scouring entire landscapes bare. Evidence of its power can be seen across the Snake River plain, giant ripple marks, boulder bars, streamlined buttes. And perhaps Malad Gorge. Some researchers believe the floodwaters, funneled through the Snake River system, overtopped the Malad drainage area and catastrophically incised the gorge in days or weeks. Others propose that it was already a groundwater-fed channel, and the flood simply exploited an existing weakness, deepening, widening, exaggerating what was already there. Still others think both are wrong. In this alternative view, Malad Gorge is primarily a product of groundwater, sapping the same erosive process suspected at Box Canyon. Here's how it works. Groundwater, pressurized within the porous basalt, seeps or bursts out of exposed cliffs, undermining the rock and causing large sections to collapse. Over time, this headward erosion creates steep-walled canyons, often with amphitheater heads and underfit streams. Sound familiar? Indeed, many geomorphologists now suspect that both mechanisms played a role. A catastrophic flood may have initiated the incision, and groundwater flow sustained it. Or perhaps it was the other way around. A long-term sapping system weakened the structure and a flood finished the job. Either way, the result is the same. A canyon too dramatic for its current river, too young for its depth, and too complex for a single theory. Malad Gorge today is a state park. Visitors walk above it on a pedestrian bridge and admire the crashing cascade at the Devil's Wash Bowl, where the river briefly remembers it's supposed to look dramatic. Interpretive signs offer neat summaries, but none of them quite explain the scale. Because here's the other twist. Malad Gorge is just one of many. Across the Snake River Plain, dozens of small to mid-sized canyons exhibit similar traits: steep walls, underfit streams, amphitheater heads, boulder-strewn floors, and abrupt geomorphology. Some have active springs, others are dry. Some are mapped in detail, most are ignored. But taken together, they point to a regional pattern, one of rapid, episodic landscape transformation. Not the slow river stories of middle school textbooks, but sudden rearrangements, floods, sapping, collapse. Idaho, in this view, isn't a landscape that was slowly carved. It's a landscape that cracked. And just downstream from the Malad, the Snake River continues its winding journey, now deeper, now stranger its path, marked by one of the largest hydrologic events in the Western Hemisphere. Because next comes the question not of what carved the land, but how much water did it take to reshape it all at once? The Bonneville flood didn't just carve gorges. It rewrote the entire river system, and we're still deciphering the edits. Bonneville flood hydraulics in Idaho. The story of southern Idaho, when told in geologic time, reads like a calm build-up to a single moment of catastrophic punctuation. And that moment, colossal, continent-shaking, and deeply misunderstood, came in the form of the Bonneville flood. Yes, it's one of the largest floods in Earth's known history. Yes, it carved canyons, toppled mountainsides, and tossed boulders the size of cabins like skipping stones. But even with decades of study, core samples, sediment analyses, and computer models, one central question remains remarkably stubborn. What exactly happened to the water here in Idaho when the flood arrived? It's not a rhetorical question, because for all the jaw-dropping statistics about the Bonneville flood's size and power, the hydraulics, the precise movement, routing, volume, and velocity of that water through Idaho's Snake River system are still the subject of active, heated, and unresolved scientific debate. Here's what we think we know. Around 14,500 years ago, glacial Lake Bonneville, an enormous inland sea covering much of present-day Utah, began to rise. Climate conditions had warmed, precipitation increased. Snowmelt fed rivers. The lake's water level climbed until it reached a natural threshold at Red Rock Pass, a low, gravelly saddle at the northern edge of the Great Basin. Then something gave. Whether it was an oversteepened slope, seismic activity, or simply a tipping point in the lake's own volume, the natural dam at Red Rock Pass collapsed. What followed was not a slow draining, but a hydrologic supernova, a wall of water estimated at 1 million cubic meters per second, hurtling northward. That's 10 times the flow of all the rivers on Earth today combined. The flood entered southern Idaho through Marsh Valley and Pocatello, merging with the Portneuf and then the Snake River. But from there, the details get hazy, because the terrain ahead wasn't simple. It was a mosaic of lava fields, floodplains, canyons, and buried valleys, some already incised, others barely touched. The Bonneville water had options, and we're still not entirely sure which ones it took. Geologists and hydrologists have tried to model it, but the models vary because the inputs vary. How high was the flood peak? How wide was the flow front? Did it follow a single path or split across multiple channels? Did it spill into side basins like the Hagerman Valley or Thousand Springs, or did it rush through in a straight line, incising as it went? Each possibility leaves a different signature. A flood that spreads wide leaves behind giant ripple marks, scablands, and thin sheets of sediment. A flood that's narrow and deep cuts vertically, dragging debris and eroding the bedrock beneath it. Idaho shows signs of both. In places like American Falls, enormous boulder bars and streamlined landforms suggest massive, high-energy flow. But downstream, through the Hagerman Reach, the flood appears to have spread and thinned, slowing as it entered broader valleys. Yet even there, it wasn't tame. It still had enough power to launch house-sized basalt blocks across the plain, rearranging the landscape in a matter of days. And then there's the Malad Gorge, Box Canyon, and other features we've already explored, each one bearing scars of sudden incision, suggesting they may have been carved or at least reshaped by the Bonneville waters. One of the most debated questions is where the floodwater bottlenecked. The Snake River narrows at several key points, particularly near Twin Falls and Thousand Springs. These choke points would have dramatically increased water pressure, leading to intense erosion and possibly even causing the flood to temporarily back up. That's right. Some models suggest that parts of the Bonneville flood may have acted like a temporary lake, dammed by the very terrain it was trying to carve through. At maximum flow, some areas in southern Idaho were likely buried under 300 to 400 feet of water. Whole valleys became temporary seas, shorelines formed and vanished in hours. The sheer weight of the flood likely triggered rockfalls, landslides, and other secondary disasters across the region. And through it all, the Snake River system was rewritten. Old meanders were cut off, new channels were born. Basalt flows that had resisted erosion for hundreds of thousands of years were pulverized in days. In some areas, the flood stripped everything down to bedrock. In others, it deposited thick blankets of sediment, burying ancient soils, tools, bones, and clues, possibly erasing whole chapters of early human occupation beneath a sudden geologic reboot. And that's part of the mystery, too. If people were living in southern Idaho before the flood, and there's mounting evidence that they were what happened to their camps, their tools, their presence, did they escape to higher ground? Did they witness the flood's arrival like a myth made real? Or did their traces simply wash away, erased by a flood no oral tradition could adequately contain? Archaeologists still search for evidence. A hearth beneath a flood deposit, a stone tool lodged in flood-borne gravel. But the clues are sparse. The water was thorough. Today, as you walk the Bonneville floodplain, the surface seems calm, quiet hills, sleepy rivers, patchwork farmland, but underneath, the scars remain. Giant ripple marks the size of buildings lie hidden beneath plowed fields. Buried boulder bars run beneath highways. Springs burst from canyon walls where the aquifer was once pressurized by the flood's mass. The flood passed, but the pressure never fully left. And in places like Thousand Springs, that pressure still finds a way out. But not all at once. There, the question shifts from violence to persistence. Because while the Bonneville flood carved the land in days, the springs have flowed for thousands of years, quietly, mysteriously, and not always where you'd expect. The Thousand Springs puzzle. From a distance, Thousand Springs looks like a glitch in the landscape. Water doesn't usually emerge that way from halfway up a canyon wall, in perfect arcs, pouring from the rock itself. But here, along the bluffs above the Snake River in south-central Idaho, water gushes directly out of the cliffs, not trickling, not seeping, but flowing, roaring, in a series of falls that seem less like geology and more like some kind of divine plumbing error. It's spectacular, it's soothing, and it's strange. The name Thousand Springs might be an exaggeration. There aren't literally 1,000 of them, but it captures the feeling of the place. Overabundance, as if the land forgot how dry it's supposed to be. This stretch of canyon, carved over millennia by the Snake River and its many geologic fits, now acts as a window into something deeper. Because these springs aren't fed by a local stream, a snowfield, or a nearby lake, they're fed by an invisible river beneath the ground. Specifically, the Eastern Snake River Plain Aquifer, one of the largest and most complex groundwater systems in North America. A sprawling, high-capacity basaltic sponge, it underlies much of southern Idaho, up to 10,000 square miles of porous lava flows and sediment layers. Rainfall, snowmelt, and irrigation runoff percolate down into the aquifer, travel for tens of miles, and finally emerge here, sometimes decades or even centuries after they first entered the ground. Thousand Springs is where that journey ends. Or at least, where it appears to end. Because not even hydrologists can agree on exactly how the water gets here or why it emerges in the volume and pattern it does. That's the puzzle. You'd think, in a state as carefully studied as Idaho, with its well-mapped volcanic layers and countless USGS reports, we'd understand the plumbing by now. But the aquifer is uncooperative. Its internal pathways are a chaos of fractured basalt, lava tubes, and buried riverbeds, features that channel water erratically, suddenly, and often with no surface indicators. Modeling this system has proven incredibly difficult. Groundwater doesn't move like surface water. It splits, meanders, speeds up, slows down. In basalt, it can travel in finger-like jets through tubes or fractures, bypassing nearby regions entirely. In some places, the flow is fast up to 10 feet per day. In others, it stalls. In still others, it dives deep and resurfaces unpredictably. Which brings us back to Thousand Springs. The question isn't just how the springs exist, it's why they're clustered here, in such dramatic numbers and discharge volumes. Why not 20 miles upstream? Why not downstream, near the same river that carved the cliffs in the first place? Some theories suggest it's a matter of pressure release. As the aquifer flows westward under the eastern Snake River plain, it eventually reaches a bottleneck in the geology, a zone where impermeable rock or structural uplift forces the water to move up and out rather than forward. The Snake River Canyon, conveniently aligned with this zone, offers a natural escape route. The result? Dozens of powerful springs erupting from the canyon wall, like pressure valves that finally popped. But here's where the mystery deepens. There's evidence that the timing and distribution of these springs has changed significantly over time. Some springs have dried up, others have shifted location. Some now flow at a fraction of their former discharge. Historical accounts from the 1,800 seconds describe larger, more numerous cascades than what we see today. Why? Human activity is one culprit. Large-scale irrigation withdrawals, especially since the 20th century, have drawn vast amounts of water from the aquifer for agriculture. That reduces pressure and lowers water tables, leading to diminished spring flows. But even this can't fully explain the variability. Some springs fluctuate independently of irrigation use. Others surge suddenly after distant rainfall events, suggesting far more complex connections than current models account for. And then there's the question of origin. Not all of the water in the aquifer is modern. Some isotope studies suggest that a portion of the groundwater feeding Thousand Springs may be paleowater remnants of precipitation from cooler, wetter climatic periods, possibly during or just after the last ice age. In that case, the springs aren't just outlets, they're time machines, releasing water that hasn't seen the sun in 10,000 years. Which raises the question, how long can this system last? Are we drawing from a renewable cycle of infiltration and discharge? Or are we tapping into a finite, ancient reserve that's slowly bleeding out? No one can say for sure. And yet, these springs have fed more than geology textbooks. They've sustained entire ecosystems, lush riparian corridors in the middle of desert country. They've nourished agriculture, supported native fish, powered hatcheries, and drawn humans to this spot for thousands of years. The abundance here is not just visual, it's ecological, economic, and spiritual. But even this abundance hides fragility. Because like every mystery in southern Idaho, the story of Thousand Springs is one of transformation. It's a feature born of old forces, volcanoes, floods, fault lines, time, and now managed, diverted, and regulated by modern hands. And that management is built on a partial understanding of what, exactly, we're dealing with. The springs remain, for now, but like everything else shaped by ancient water, they are prone to change. And just upstream, there's a fossil bed one that speaks to what happens when water stops sustaining life and starts entombing it. At the Hagerman horse quarry, the question isn't just why so many horses died, it's why they all died here. Hagerman Horse Quarry. Why so many? The first thing you notice is how intact they are. Skeletons, not scattered, but aligned, limbs folded, spines curved, skulls intact like they simply lay down and never got up. The Hagerman Horse Quarry, nestled along the bluffs above the Snake River near the town of Hagerman, holds one of the richest concentrations of fossilized horses in the world. Over 200 individual specimens, buried together in a space no bigger than a few classrooms. The official name of the species is Equus simplicidans, but they're more famously known as the Hagerman horses, a zebra-like early member of the horse family, around the size of a modern Arabian, with shorter legs, striped markings, and a life lived in herds. They're Idaho's state fossil, a symbol of ancient life, and also the focal point of one of Idaho's most enduring and quietly haunting mysteries. Why did they all die here? Let's rewind. The setting is the Pliocene epoch, roughly 3.5 million years ago, long before humans entered the scene, before the Snake River carved its canyon, before glaciers gripped the continent. This part of Idaho was part of a massive lake system, warmer, wetter, and teeming with life. The hills were grasslands and wetlands. A savanna of sorts, filled with camels, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, and small, striped horses that grazed in large, skittish herds. And then, something happened. The Hagerman site isn't just a graveyard. It's a stacked, compressed, and dense fossil deposit. Most of the horses appear to be from the same species. Many are of similar age. Some are adults, others juveniles, but all seem to have died around the same time and in the same place. They didn't die miles apart and get washed here later. They died here, together, in a single episode or series of episodes no one fully understands. There are theories. Always. The traditional explanation is drought. The idea is that water sources dried up, and the animals desperate for hydration congregated at a shrinking pool, eventually succumbing to dehydration or disease. Their bodies preserved in the fine sediments at the water's edge. Plausible? Yes. But problematic. Because if that were the case, you'd expect to find more species predators, scavengers, other herbivores drawn to the same waterhole. You'd expect signs of scavenging, trampling, fragmentation. Instead, you get uniformity. Horses laid out like dominoes, intact, undisturbed. Another theory is a flood event. Perhaps a sudden inundation overwhelmed a herd, sweeping them into a depression, drowning them en masse. But here again, the evidence is inconvenient. The bones aren't jumbled or broken, they're articulated. Some are stacked. Some show signs of slow sedimentation. Whatever killed them didn't scatter them. A third theory proposes a kind of natural trap. Maybe a marshy shoreline collapsed, trapping the horses in sticky mud. Unable to escape, they died in place. This would explain the articulation and the single species concentration. But again, why so many? Why would an entire herd be caught without a single survivor? And why are there multiple layers of horse fossils, not just one? The science doesn't offer closure, only complexity. There's also the question of preservation. The fossils here are astonishingly well preserved. The fine-grained silt and volcanic ash layers laid down by intermittent flows and gentle deposition created a Lagerstätte, a fossil bed of extraordinary fidelity. In some cases, researchers have recovered not just bones but trace elements of cartilage and fur impressions. Nature doesn't usually do this unless the burial is quick, precise, and protected from the chaos of weather and scavengers. Which suggests something unique happened here. Something sudden. And something that happened more than once. Some researchers now lean toward a multi-event scenario. Several smaller die-offs over hundreds or thousands of years, each depositing a new layer of horse remains in the same depositional basin. That would explain the vertical stratification. It would also suggest that this particular spot, whatever it looked like at the time, was repeatedly deadly. A kill basin. A death magnet. But why? And here's the part that nags. This fossil bed isn't remote. It's just above the Snake River, in an area that still shifts with sediment and water. Could later floods have exposed earlier graves? Could Pleistocene erosion have revealed layers of pre-existing fossils? Could volcanic ash from nearby eruptions have both killed and buried the herds? Yes, possibly, maybe. And that's the problem. Even with over 200 skeletons laid bare, arranged like clues on the crime scene of deep time, we still don't know what happened. And every answer seems to lead to a bigger question. Because just south of here, in Nebraska, there's another fossil site, ash fall fossil beds, where animals were buried alive in volcanic ash. And the ash from that site? Traced chemically to Idaho. Ash fall's distant doom. Nebraska doesn't usually make the list of volcanic danger zones. No fault lines, no eruptions, no smoldering calderas, just cornfields, clouds, and the occasional ghost town. And yet, 12 million years ago, the skies darkened above what is now northeastern Nebraska, not because of anything happening there, but because of something exploding far away in what we now call Idaho. This is the paradox of ashfall fossil beds, a preserved, eerie snapshot of mass death, suffocation, and stillness caused by a supervolcano that didn't erupt in place, but sent its consequences riding the jet stream. And that eruption? It came from the Bruneau-Jarbidge volcanic field, part of the Snake River Plain's long and fiery history of supereruptions. This was no ordinary volcanic tantrum. This was a high silica, caldera-forming cataclysm, one of many that preceded the formation of what is now Yellowstone. And the ash it produced? Hundreds of cubic miles of it, lofted into the atmosphere and carried east across the plains like a grim parade. In Nebraska, what that ash did was astonishing. At ashfall, the layer is roughly 1 to 2 meters thick, fine, silty, and deadly. Beneath it lie the fossilized remains of dozens of Miocene animals, rhinos, horses, camels, birds, and turtles. What makes this site so disturbing is its detail. Many of the skeletons are intact, still in life position. There are even signs of last breaths, tails curled, heads tilted back, limbs folded under. And most haunting of all, they didn't die instantly. The ash layer thickens gradually. Animals survived the initial fall, continued to graze, and then began to succumb over days or weeks, their lungs filled with microscopic glass shards. They collapsed where they stood. The fossil record at ashfall isn't one of trauma, it's one of slow suffocation. And Idaho is responsible. The Bruneau-Jarbidge eruption, dated to roughly 12.7 million years ago, was just one of several supervolcanic blasts along the Snake River Plain. These events weren't as famous as Yellowstone, but in terms of ash output and ecological impact, they were world-class. The ash that reached Nebraska was chemically fingerprinted, matched to the unique geochemical signature of the Bruneau-Jarbidge rhyolites. It's forensic geology, and it links a peaceful Nebraskan savanna to a volcanic nightmare 1,000 miles away, which raises several fascinating and unsettling questions. If this ash traveled that far, where else did it fall? What was happening in Idaho during the eruption? What animals, what people, if any, might have lived on the Snake River Plain during these blasts, and how did they respond? There are no known mass death fossil beds in Idaho that mirror ashfall's haunting detail. Maybe erosion erased them. Maybe the land was uninhabitable at the time. Maybe we simply haven't found them yet. But the absence of such a site in the blast zone is itself mysterious. Because Nebraska preserved the consequence. But Idaho was the cause. And it would not be the last time strange life emerged from Idaho's post-apocalyptic ground. Because after the supervolcanoes cooled and the ash settled, something unexpected rose up in the fossil record. In the canyon near Paris, Idaho, beneath Triassic stone, an entire ancient ecosystem appears. One that shouldn't have. Paris Canyon's Paris Biota, high in the rolling hills of southeastern Idaho, past the quiet town of Paris and tucked into the limestone outcrops of Paris Canyon, lies a fossil bed that, at first glance, doesn't look like much. Just another pale strip of weathered stone, eroding into the sagebrush under a sky that doesn't care. But what lies within that stone has sent paleontologists into existential spirals for decades. Because this site doesn't just hold fossils. It holds a recovery, an unlikely resurgence of life following one of the most devastating mass extinctions in Earth's history. This is the Paris Biota, a window into the early Triassic, roughly 250 million years ago, when life on Earth was still crawling out of the ruins of the Permian extinction, a cataclysm that wiped out an estimated 95% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial species. The Earth had choked on its own atmosphere, ecosystems collapsed, oceans stagnated. Life, as far as we could tell, was all but snuffed out. And yet, somehow, here in Idaho, something remarkable happened. In the finely laminated limestone of Paris Canyon, researchers have uncovered an unexpectedly diverse marine ecosystem, a fossilized community of invertebrates, fish, and soft-bodied creatures that shouldn't have been able to exist. Not so soon, not so richly, not here. Because the story we've told about the early Triassic is one of slow recovery. For tens of millions of years after the extinction event, life is supposed to have limped along low diversity, high stress, ecosystems just barely functioning. And for the most part, that narrative fits the global record. But the Paris Biota breaks the rule. It includes more than 30 taxa of marine organisms, sponges, bivalves, echinoderms, soft-bodied worms, crustaceans, and even early fish species, all preserved in extraordinary detail. Some of the soft tissue impressions are so finely preserved that scientists can study muscle fibers and digestive tracts. This isn't just survival, this is flourishing. So how did it happen? That's the mystery. The water in this part of Idaho, 250 million years ago, was part of a shallow inland sea, one of many that once stretched across the western interior of North America. Most of these seas were anoxic at the time, oxygen poor, overheated, and prone to sudden collapses. But the Paris Basin seems to have been an exception, a small ecological refuge, where conditions stabilized just enough for life to take hold again. Some researchers point to local upwelling currents, bringing cooler, oxygenated water into the basin. Others suspect a quirk of geography. Maybe Paris Canyon was just in the right spot, at the right time, with the right combination of temperature, chemistry, and shelter. But whatever the cause, the implications are massive. Because if one spot, one slice of ocean floor could rebound this quickly and this completely, it suggests that ecosystem recovery after extinction may be far more complex than we thought. It's not just about waiting millions of years for conditions to improve. It's about microhabitats, local stability, tiny cracks in the curtain of extinction where life can still breathe. And that raises the next uncomfortable question. How many other Paris canyons have we missed? How many of Earth's so-called dead zones were actually pulsing with quiet life that we've simply failed to uncover? What other signs of resilience lie buried under layers we wrote off as barren? And what does it mean that this story comes from Idaho, a land we associate with plains and potatoes, not primordial oceans? It means the past is buried in places that no longer resemble themselves. Which makes the next stop on this winding journey even stranger. Because if Paris Canyon is a fossil record of too much life, then just west of it, near Clarkia, we find something almost as bizarre. Too much detail. Clarkia's mummified leaves. In northern Idaho, near the tiny town of Clarkia, there's a fossil site that looks like someone tried to press an entire Miocene forest into a book and then forgot to close the cover. The result? Leaves. Thousands of them. Fossilized not in silhouette, not in stone imprint, but in something eerily close to their original form. Veins, cell structures, pigments, leaves with color. This isn't supposed to happen. Fossils are usually impressions, carbon outlines of things long gone, but the leaves at Clarkia are different. They look fresh. Not alive, certainly, but not fully dead either. A kind of botanical afterlife, preserved in exquisite, unsettling clarity. The age of the deposit is roughly 15 million years, mid-Miocene, a time when this part of Idaho was warmer, wetter, and forested with redwoods, maples, alders, oaks, and ginkgos. The site itself is an ancient lakebed, where seasonal layers of fine volcanic ash and silt accumulated so quickly and so gently that fallen leaves sank into an anoxic, undisturbed soup. No oxygen, no bacteria, no decay. Just slow burial, and an environment so chemically stable that cell walls didn't break down. In some cases, even the original chlorophyll compounds have been partially preserved. Under the right lab conditions, the leaves still turn green for a few moments when exposed to light. Let that sink in. These are 5 million-year-old leaves that still remember how to photosynthesize. And yet, despite this jaw-dropping preservation, the Clarkia site is poorly understood. For one, it's fragile. Exposure to air causes rapid decay. The moment a fossil leaf is pulled from the shale, the clock starts ticking. Within hours, the color fades. Within days, the structure begins to collapse. Preservation requires instant stabilization, often in liquid nitrogen or airtight resin. As a result, many early discoveries were lost before proper documentation could occur. Second, the dating of the site is still being refined. While volcanic ash layers provide helpful markers, the precise sequence of deposition and the connection to broader Miocene climate shifts is still under study. Some models suggest the lake was short-lived. Others think it persisted for thousands of years, slowly capturing the flora of entire climatic epochs. And then there's the leaf chemistry. Researchers are now using Clarkia fossils to reconstruct past climate conditions, temperature, rainfall, seasonal variation. But the results raise more questions than answers. The diversity of species suggests a transitional zone between coastal rainforest and inland woodland. But how did such a lush, complex ecosystem exist this far inland during a period that global models show as increasingly arid? Again, Idaho defies the trend. And perhaps most oddly, the Clarkia leaves are silent in another way. There are no large animal fossils at the site. No deer, no rodents, not even bird bones. It's a fossil forest, frozen in time, without a single fossil footstep. Whether this is due to the lake's depth, the chemistry, or simple chance is unknown. So once again, we're left with a mystery that's not about what's missing, but about what shouldn't be preserved at all. Too many pigments, too much data, too little explanation. And next, we leave behind plants and turn our attention to something sharper: obsidian, the dark glass of ancient trade, traced across mountain ranges, found where it shouldn't be. Because Idaho's volcanic glass didn't stay local, it traveled far. Obsidian highways. Obsidian is a paradox. Fragile but deadly. A rock but glass. Born of fire but used with precision. And in the prehistoric world, it was more than just a cutting tool. It was a currency, a signal, a trail marker. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Idaho, where sources like Brown's Bench, Bear Gulch, and Timber Butte produced obsidian so chemically distinct that modern science can trace it like a forensic signature. And here's what we know. Idaho's obsidian traveled. A lot. Hundreds of miles. Across mountain ranges. Through deserts. From one cultural group to another, until flakes and blades from an Idaho lava flow ended up in caches and campsites as far away as California, British Columbia, and Wyoming. And here's what we don't know: why certain sources dominated while others didn't. Why some obsidian was traded frequently and others barely moved. Why, despite its functional similarities, not all obsidian was treated equally. These are the obsidian highways, routes of exchange and migration that we can map today using X-ray fluorescence and neutron activation analysis. Each source has a unique chemical fingerprint, tiny ratios of trace elements like zirconium, rubidium, strontium. With a few lab tests, a tiny flake from a prehistoric site can be matched to its volcanic birthplace. And the results reveal patterns of movement that don't always match our expectations. Take Brown's Bench, for example, one of the most prolific obsidian sources in southern Idaho. It lies near the modern Idaho-Nevada border and was heavily used during the Archaic and late prehistoric periods. Obsidian from Brown's Bench has been found across a vast area through northern Utah, central Nevada, and even parts of the Sierra Nevada. And yet, it wasn't always the closest source to the sites where it was found. Why go out of your way for this obsidian? Was it sharper, more abundant, more culturally valued? That's part of the mystery. Another example is Bear Gulch, a source located on the southern edge of the eastern Snake River Plain. Its obsidian is rarer in the archaeological record, but when it does appear, it often shows up far from home, sometimes in high-altitude sites deep in the Rocky Mountains, far beyond where you'd expect to find a small volume source like Bear Gulch represented. In some cases, this glass moved 200 to 300 miles from source to site. And then there's Timber Butte, northwest of Boise. Its obsidian is chemically distinct and relatively localized, but analysis shows that it was selectively traded, showing up at some sites frequently and others not at all. Some archaeologists speculate this points to exclusive social networks, small groups with direct access, who traded the glass along tightly controlled lines. But here's the kicker. When compared across time, obsidian use patterns in Idaho show fluctuations. Some sources were dominant during certain periods, then fell out of favor. Others emerged later with seemingly no change in accessibility. It's not just about distance, it's about social preference, trade, territory, possibly even ideology. Because obsidian isn't just practical, it's visual, dark, reflective, sometimes translucent. It cuts cleanly, shatters dramatically, and carries connotations of status and ritual. In some cultures, it was used in burials. In others, for offerings. In others still, for the simple logic of butchering an elk. But the deeper question lingers. Who moved it? And how far did those people go? Obsidian, in this context, becomes a proxy for prehistoric mobility. A flake found 300 miles from its source suggests not just a trade, but a connection, a shared trail, a story passed along with the stone. And the fact that these obsidian artifacts show up in very different cultural contexts, Clovis, Western stemmed, Archaic, and beyond, suggests that the networks weren't just long, they were old. So we map them. Carefully, a few grams of volcanic glass, plucked from a lava flow thousands of years ago, now points to a person, a journey, a decision made in a landscape we barely recognize. And one of the most puzzling patterns? Timber Butte's reach. It traveled in ways that don't quite make sense. Which is exactly where we're headed next. Timber Butte's reach. Timber Butte is not especially dramatic. It doesn't dominate the skyline. It doesn't smoke or steam or hiss reminders of volcanic glory. It's a low, weathered rise in the basalt-rimmed desert northwest of Boise, a place you could drive past without knowing you've passed through one of the most intriguing obsidian source zones in the entire Intermountain West. And yet, the obsidian from Timber Butte has a story that refuses to stay put. It shows up in places it shouldn't, at distances too far to dismiss, in volumes too high to ignore. It was not the most prolific source in Idaho, nor the most accessible, but its presence is disproportionate. In some regions, Timber Butte obsidian dominates the archaeological record. In others, it's inexplicably absent. And in every case, it seems to defy simple geographic logic. In one study, Timber Butte obsidian flakes were found nearly 200 miles to the east in sites located deep in the Snake River Basin, places that had easier access to other, closer sources. Yet they used Timber Butte, frequently, in meaningful quantities. Why? There's no evidence the glass itself was superior. Its flaking quality is fine, but not uniquely so. Other nearby sources like Brown's Bench or Indian Creek offered similar material. And yet, Timber Butte's glass traveled more consistently, over greater distances, and in patterns that hint at something else. That something else might be social. Archaeologists have started to theorize that Timber Butte obsidian wasn't just a tool, it was part of a cultural package. Maybe it signaled identity. Maybe it was tied to specific clans, lineages, or trade alliances. Maybe it was embedded in spiritual or ritual practices. Maybe it served as a kind of prehistoric branding, a badge of connection to a place or to the people who lived there. One hypothesis suggests that Timber Butte lay at the center of a highly mobile group's territory, a group whose seasonal rounds stretched far across the southern Idaho landscape. As they moved, they took obsidian with them, not just to use, but to trade, to give, to share. In this model, Timber Butte's reach isn't an accident, it's a footprint, a trace of human movement, not just of materials but of meaning. The distribution of the glass becomes a proxy for social boundaries, or their absence. Because sometimes what Timber Butte really represents is the blurring of borders where one valley's traditions bleed into another's, and the only thing connecting them is a flake of black glass, left behind in a hearth or dropped beside a creek. Some archaeologists have even gone so far as to propose Timber Butte as an early nodal point, a hub in a regional trade network that operated well before the rise of sedentary villages, a waypoint, a rendezvous, a place where people gathered not to settle, but to pass through, and in doing so, left behind pieces of themselves etched in obsidian and fire. And maybe that's the real mystery. What else moved with the glass? Ideas? Stories? Rituals? Gene flow? Timber Butte doesn't answer these questions. But it makes us ask them, because the tools weren't just made, they were moved. And the next thing we find, just over the ridge from some of these obsidian-rich sites, are earth ovens buried in the basalt. Ovens used to bake a root called Camas, a plant so important it shaped migration patterns, gender roles, and even land ownership. But when exactly did those ovens appear? And how long have they been cooking? Camas ovens through time. There are few plants in the prehistoric West that rival Camas in cultural importance. It doesn't look like much a modest purple-blue flower that rises in clusters from damp prairie soil each spring. But beneath the surface lies a starchy bulb, rich in carbohydrates and slow-releasing energy that sustained communities for generations. It wasn't just food. It was season, ceremony, strategy, and sovereignty. And in Idaho, Camas left behind one of the most enduring traces of indigenous land use, earth ovens. Across southern and central Idaho, in places like the Camas Prairie, Weiser River drainage, and Snake River Plain, archaeologists have documented hundreds of prehistoric pit ovens built to bake Camas bulbs. They're easy to miss if you're not looking, just shallow depressions in the ground, sometimes ringed with fire-cracked rocks, occasionally masked by new vegetation. But under excavation, they reveal a wealth of information: charcoal, stone tools, baked soil, sometimes layers of Camas residue or pollen grains, quiet evidence of millennia of return. And yet, the deeper question remains: how old are they? Dating earth ovens is notoriously tricky. The structures themselves are ephemeral. The same spot was often reused over and over again, with old ovens reopened, expanded, or built on top of. Charcoal layers may reflect dozens of cooking events collapsed into a single blurry signal, and even when a good radiocarbon date emerges, it often represents just one use, not the entire lifespan of the oven. What we do know is that Camas baking goes back thousands of years. Some ovens in Idaho date to at least 5,000 years ago, with others possibly pushing closer to 8,000. And oral traditions from Plateau and Great Basin indigenous communities, particularly the Shoshone Bannock and Nez Perce, describe a much longer continuity of Camas use, reaching into the time before memory. The baking process wasn't simple. It took days. First, the ovens were dug often in soil chosen for its heat retention. Stones were heated in large surface fires, then placed at the bottom of the pit. Camas bulbs, sometimes soaked or pounded to reduce bitterness, were layered over the stones. Everything was covered with vegetation, then sealed with soil. A slow bake, sometimes 24 to 48 hours, converted the inulin starches in the bulb into fructose, making the camas both sweet and digestible. This was not a survival food. This was cuisine. The ovens weren't isolated either. Around them, archaeologists often find tools for digging, processing, and storage. Grinding stones, basketry impressions, stone knives. And in some cases, near rivers or highland travel routes, these oven sites clustered dozens within a few square kilometers, suggesting that people returned to the same Camas fields year after year, maybe even generation after generation. But not all Camas ovens are the same. Some are shallow and temporary. Others are massive, lined with carefully chosen stone, deep enough to suggest communal feasts or large-scale processing. The variation hints at changing uses over time. Were the larger ovens signs of abundance, intertribal gatherings, or simply shifts in cooking efficiency? The changes don't track neatly. Camas use seems to spike in some regions during the Middle Holocene, then shift to other zones later. In some cases, new oven sites appear hundreds of miles away, as if seasonal rounds were altered, territories renegotiated, or climate changes forced new patterns. Even today, Camas distribution is fickle. It thrives in moist meadows, but these can dry out or flood depending on subtle shifts in climate. Managing these fields through controlled burns, replanting, or rotation was likely part of the traditional knowledge tied to oven use, and yet we've barely scratched the surface of that ecological intelligence. The ovens still exist, but their timeline remains blurry. Are the oldest ones 10,000 years old? Possibly. But until more are excavated and more radiocarbon samples are secured, the deep chronology of Camas baking in Idaho remains more story than science. And speaking of stories carved into the rock near many of these oven sites are petroglyphs, some abstract, some figurative, all difficult to date, all difficult to translate. Take Wiesbar, for instance. There, dense fields of petroglyphs sprawl across the lava near Swan Falls Dam. They weren't left by accident. But who left them, and when, is still an open case. Who drew Wiesbar, and when? The Snake River curves wide and slow near Swan Falls, its surface reflecting sun, basalt, and time. But along the rugged cliffs and boulders that line its banks is something the river does not reflect, it only hints at. Wiesbar, one of Idaho's most expansive and perplexing concentrations of petroglyphs, etched into black volcanic stone by people we still know far too little about. The carvings are everywhere: figures, spirals, circles, grids, zoomorphic forms. Some are deeply pecked, weathered to a dusty patina. Others are sharper, more recent-looking. The range of age is uncertain. The range of meaning, even more so. Wiesbar sits within a much broader zone of prehistoric activity, part of the Guffey Butte-Black Butte Archaeological District, which contains one of the highest densities of prehistoric rock art in the region. That density alone raises questions. Why here? Was this a settlement zone? A transit corridor? A ceremonial complex? Or something else entirely? The first challenge is chronology. When were these petroglyphs made? Unlike organic materials, rock art is notoriously difficult to date. There are no pigments to radiocarbon test. There's no stratigraphy to place them in. Researchers rely on indirect clues, levels of repatination, how dark the rock surface has become, stylistic comparisons, and association with nearby artifacts. Some carvings at Wiesbar may be as young as 300 years old. Others could be more than 10,000. That's not a typo. 10,000. If true, that would place some of these petroglyphs among the oldest surviving visual expressions on the North American continent. Stylistically, the Wiesbar glyphs include Columbia Plateau traditions, abstract, curvilinear designs, common across much of the interior Northwest, as well as Great Basin elements. This suggests a crossroads, a place where cultural traditions overlapped, a frontier of ideas. One theory is that the petroglyphs mark travel routes, trail signs, territorial markers, seasonal waypoints. This would fit with Wispar's location along a major river corridor, just downstream from major Camas fields and upstream from Obsidian trade routes. But many glyphs don't seem practical. They seem symbolic. Some may be ritual, others may encode myths, and some may just be the prehistoric equivalent of public art meant to be seen, remembered, interpreted. There's also the question of continuity. Were these glyphs carved by a single culture over time, or by many, each adding a new layer to the stone? The presence of multiple styles suggests successive use, perhaps even successive meanings. A spiral to one group may have marked a camp, to another, a calendar, to a third, a warning. And then there's the matter of absence. No large village sites, no burial grounds, no long-term habitations have been confirmed directly adjacent to the petroglyphs. The people who carved here did not stay long. Or, if they did, their dwellings were made of materials lost to time: willow, tule, hide. Or perhaps the point was not to stay at all. Perhaps Wispar was meant to be passed through a kind of open-air ledger, recording travelers, teachings, visions, a public stone book with no fixed author. And still, we ask the same question. Who drew these? And always behind that, when? Because if we could date the glyphs, we might also date the people, their migrations, their memories. But instead, we are left with marks in stone, layered like echoes. And echoes can be misleading. Just ask anyone who's tried to piece together Idaho's earliest tool traditions from Windust to Hask, where the tools may survive, but the timeline remains as jagged as the rocks they were carved from Windust to Hask. In the taxonomy of early North American stone tool traditions, names are both helpful and misleading. They give form to ambiguity. They offer a semblance of order in a world of scattered artifacts and broken timelines. But they also imply neat categories, linear progressions, cultural walls, endings, and beginnings. The truth, especially in Idaho, is far murkier. Take Windust and Hask, two projectile point traditions found across the Columbia Plateau and Snake River Plain. They're separated by shape, by technology, and supposedly by time. Windust is generally older, Hask comes later. But in the archaeological record, they overlap, they coexist, and sometimes they show up in the same layers. And that, more than anything, is the problem. Let's start with Windust. Named after a site on the Snake River in southeastern Washington, the Windust phase is typically dated to around 11,000 to 8,000 years ago. Its points are long, narrow, often unfluted, with distinctive shoulders. Windust tools show up in riverine contexts, sites near lakes, floodplains, and seasonal water sources, often alongside small game remains, fish bones, and plant processing features. It's a tradition associated with the late Paleo-Indian or early Archaic transition, a time when big game was disappearing, and foragers began to diversify. But in Idaho, Windust points appear inconsistently. Some sites show clear occupation, others only fragments. And at several locations, Windust-style points are found above or beside what are traditionally thought to be older point types, especially Hask, which flips the timeline on its head. Hask points are typically long, lanceolate, and often large, sometimes very large. They're often associated with the Western stemmed tradition, which may date back as far as 13,000, 14,000 years. But again, the range is wide. Hask points have been recovered from early contexts, like at Redfish Rock Shelter and WLC-1 near Twin Falls, but have also been found in clearly younger settings. In some cases, Windust and Hask points show up in the same site, with no clear stratigraphic separation. So what's going on? One possibility is that these types were never discrete cultural stages, but coexisting traditions used by different groups, or even the same group for different purposes. Maybe Hask points were specialized tools used for large game or ceremonial hunts, while Windust points were general purpose, Maybe they mark regional preferences, not temporal phases. Another possibility is that the typology is simply flawed, that the name traditions reflect our need to categorize more than actual cultural divisions. That stone tool styles weren't strictly bound by time or tribe, but instead drifted organically, changing slowly, inconsistently, influenced by ecology, mobility, or individual preference. This is the danger of letting shapes define chronology. In Idaho, the soil doesn't always cooperate. Stratigraphy is often disturbed by floods, rodents, tree roots, or centuries of seasonal freezing and thawing. Points move, layers shift. And radiocarbon dates, when available, often have wide error margins, especially in open-air sites. All of this makes it difficult to say when, exactly, Hask ends and Windust begins, or if they ever really did. Which is why the focus has shifted toward assemblage-based analysis, looking not just at individual tools, but at whole toolkits, hearth features, processing areas, and site layouts. This broader approach paints a more complex picture. Early Idaho foragers weren't moving through in waves. They were settling in, returning, reusing sites, and adapting in real time to changing landscapes. And this is where archaeology meets ghost story. Because if we can't distinguish Windust from Hask cleanly, then how can we trust the temporal boundaries of the sites we've already lost, buried, flooded, or erased by infrastructure? Take American Falls, for example. A place where entire clusters of early camps, kill sites, and possible dwellings were submerged under a reservoir. Now, we can only glimpse them when the water recedes. American Falls lost and found sites. Stand on the edge of the American Falls Reservoir, especially during a low water year, and you'll see a shoreline that looks like it's trying to forget something. Muddy terraces, scattered stones, maybe the exposed foundations of an old structure or two. But what you won't see, unless you know exactly where to look, are the ghost traces of some of Idaho's most significant and frustratingly inaccessible prehistoric sites. Long before the town of American Falls existed, before the dam, before the reservoir swallowed the riverbanks, this stretch of the Snake River was teeming with human life. The convergence of river, canyon, and seasonal migration made it a natural gathering point. For thousands of years, people came here to fish, to hunt, to gather roots, and to stay sometimes briefly, sometimes perhaps long enough to leave behind hearths, bone beds, and tool caches. And for a while, those traces remained visible, excavatable. In the early 20th century, archaeologists and avocational diggers began to realize just how rich the American Falls area was. Sites like Owl Cave, filled with bison, remains, and early tools, were documented and partially excavated. Nearby, other localities revealed dense clusters of artifacts: projectile points, scrapers, awls, burned bone, and debitage. Some materials were found deep, suggesting great age, possibly stretching into the terminal Pleistocene. Others showed clear use into the late prehistoric and historic periods. This was not a flash-in-the-pan campsite. This was a persistent place. And then, the dam came. Completed in the 1,920 seconds, and later expanded, the American Falls Dam created a reservoir that drowned entire site complexes under water and sediment. Some locations were excavated in haste. Others were never studied at all. And with every passing year, as water levels fluctuate and sediment builds, the evidence becomes harder to reach, buried under a veil of infrastructure. Today, what we know about many of these sites comes from fragments, early excavation notes, museum collections with questionable provenience, surface finds, and the occasional lucky exposure during drought years. And yet, even these fragments hint at something profound. Some of the projectile points found at American Falls resemble early Western-stemmed and even Hask types. Others reflect later traditions: Elko, Rosegate, desert-side notched. The stratigraphy, where preserved, tells a story of layered occupation generation after generation, returning to the same spots, modifying them, rebuilding them, possibly even remembering them. In recent years, renewed interest in the area, fueled by advances in remote sensing and collaboration with tribal nations, has led to targeted surveys when water levels permit. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and coring have revealed buried surfaces that may hold hearths, middens, or undisturbed occupation layers. But access is fleeting. One season, a feature might be visible. The next, it's underwater again. And some sites will likely remain forever submerged, known only by name, location, and the few artifacts salvaged before the water claimed them. Which raises an uncomfortable point. How much of Idaho's deep history now lies under reservoirs, roads, and subdivisions? How many Windust and Hask sites disappeared before we even knew what they were? And what stories were buried, not just by sediment, but by decisions? Yet American Falls still whispers. Even in loss, it gives us just enough to believe that early people were here, that they watched the river change, that they adapted and endured. And in their fire pits, we sometimes find something surprising: salmon bones. Which means they weren't just hunting, they were fishing. And that opens a new set of questions. How long have salmon been on the Idaho menu, and how far did those early meals travel to reach the plate? Salmon on the menu since when? In the mythology of the Pacific Northwest, few creatures hold as much symbolic and ecological weight as the salmon. It swims upstream not just in rivers, but in stories, economies, and memories. In modern times, it's a fish that sparks lawsuits, environmental regulations, and protests. But in prehistoric Idaho, long before hatcheries and hydroelectric dams, salmon was already on the menu, and possibly long before we thought. The bones tell the story, quietly, fragment by fragment. In sites like Buhl, Owl Cave, and scattered camps along the Clearwater, Salmon, and Lower Snake Rivers, researchers have found fish remains embedded in hearths, midden deposits, and even in human burials. Most of these bones are fragmentary vertebrae, jaw pieces, tiny scales turned to ash. But under the microscope, they reveal themselves unmistakably. Oncorhynchus, the genus of Pacific salmon. And the question that flows from them is deceptively simple. Since when? How early did people in what is now Idaho begin harvesting anadromous fish, those born in freshwater, fattened in the ocean, and returned upriver to die? There's no easy answer. The problem isn't absence of evidence, it's the fragility of fish bones, especially in open-air sites where acidity, weather, and even rodents conspire to destroy the record. And even when salmon remains are found, it's not always clear if they reflect local catch or trade. Could a site 200 miles inland have received dried or smoked fish from a coastal group? Possibly. But then why do we also find cut marks, burn patterns, and discard piles consistent with on-site processing? Some of the earliest hints come from the Buhl burial, where stable isotope analysis of the woman's bones suggests a diet that included marine-derived protein, a signature consistent with regular salmon consumption. The burial dates to roughly 10,600 years ago, placing salmon on the Idaho table much earlier than previously assumed. Elsewhere, fish remains from Owl Cave and Wilson Butte Cave appear in layers dating back 9,000 years or more. These sites lie along rivers that would have been accessible to salmon during their annual runs, especially before modern dams altered the flows. In the Clearwater Basin, a region rich with later Nez Perce fishery traditions, sites have yielded layered evidence of seasonal salmon processing. Fire pits filled with tiny burned bones, net sinkers carved from stone, weirs and fish traps, though rarely preserved, have left behind clues in the form of alignments, stakes, and even ghost imprints in the soil. These weren't one-off meals. They were logistical operations, seasonal strategies that required knowledge of migration, water levels, and preservation. But again, the timing remains murky. The archaeological record suggests a gradual intensification of salmon use, starting sporadically in the early Holocene and becoming more central during the Middle and Late Holocene. As mobility patterns shifted and river ecosystems stabilized, this makes sense. Early populations may have harvested salmon opportunistically, while later groups organized around the predictable returns of the runs. And yet, there's still that nagging question: how far back does it really go? Could early Paleo-Indian groups, those who made Hask or Clovis-like tools, have fished for salmon in Idaho? Possibly, but we'd need a site with exceptional preservation and datable context to prove it. So far, we have only tantalizing shadows, isotopes in bones, tool types near rivers, a few charred vertebrae where they shouldn't be. That said, the logical assumption is this: where salmon could reach, people were already eating them. And in prehistoric Idaho, salmon could reach remarkably far. The Snake River alone once hosted millions of salmon each year. Chinook, coho, sockeye, traveling hundreds of miles from the Pacific. Some made it as far as the headwaters of the Salmon River near Stanley, Idaho. Imagine that. A fish born in gravel beds near the Continental Divide, swimming to the ocean and back, only to be roasted over a basalt-lined hearth at some forgotten riverside camp. Today, we argue over salmon. In prehistoric times, people depended on them. Their runs weren't just meals, they were calendars, migrations, trade opportunities, even spiritual rituals. And the fact that we're only beginning to understand their place in ancient diets says less about the people who fished them and more about our own tendency to overlook what doesn't fossilize well. Salmon don't leave big bones, but they leave big gaps when they disappear. And while we've focused on rivers so far, there's another mystery out on the lava plains, one that doesn't involve water at all. It involves crossing fire, prehistoric travel across lava. If you've ever stood on the eastern Snake River plain, you know how alien it feels. A vast, broken sea of black basalt, sharp as glass in some places, pocked with craters, tubes, and collapsed skylights in others. The landscape doesn't flow, it fractures. Even now, walking across it requires care, strategy, and sometimes a very good GPS. And yet, long before modern trails, long before roads, people were moving across it. The question is, how? And more importantly, why? The Snake River Plain, and particularly its eastern section, is the product of massive volcanic activity over the past several million years, part of the same geologic conveyor belt that eventually created the Yellowstone hotspot. The basalt flows here are relatively young, geologically speaking. Some are only a few thousand years old. Others are older, but no less treacherous. They stretch for miles, forming natural barriers to movement across southern Idaho. Or so you'd think. Because embedded in the margins of this volcanic expanse are clues that people didn't just avoid the lava, they crossed it. And repeatedly. The evidence is subtle. Scattered tool fragments, charcoal flecks in shelter alcoves, cache pits, and in rare cases, full archaeological sites nestled into pockets of soil amid the rock. These aren't just signs of random travelers. They suggest deliberate routes, paths across a landscape that modern hikers would hesitate to touch. So what drove them? Trade, for one. The Obsidian routes we discussed earlier cross portions of the lava plain. So do connections between Camas fields, river valleys, and highland hunting zones. The lava may have been harsh, but it also lay between resources worth accessing. Mobility in prehistoric Idaho wasn't optional. It was survival. But how did they navigate? Here's where things get stranger. Some archaeologists propose that certain lava flows were crossed via natural causeways, linear features like pressure ridges, pahoe crusts, or remnant soil patches between flows. These features, though difficult to spot from ground level, can show up in satellite imagery. In recent years, high-resolution LiDAR and drone surveys have identified linear corridors that may correspond to ancient travel routes. And there's more. Along some of these suspected paths, researchers have found rock cairns, alignments, and even small cleared areas that might have served as camps, markers, or logistical caches. Were they trail signs? Territorial markers? Waypoints for those crossing a hostile land? Possibly all of the above. But even if we can't fully reconstruct the routes, the fact that people moved through this landscape is clear, and perhaps even more impressive is what they left in the lava. In some locations, like at craters of the Moon or along the margins of the Hell's Half-Acre lava field, archaeologists have found storage pits, carefully constructed using basalt slabs to protect stored roots or meat from predators and the elements. That's not casual travel. That's planned return. It suggests knowledge not just of the land, but of its seasonality, its risks, and its roots. But the lava didn't just offer obstacles. In some cases, it offered shelter caves, lava tubes, shaded overhangs where people could rest, hide from storms, or perhaps even leave behind a few marks of their presence. Pictographs and tool fragments have been found in a few of these locations, though many remain unexplored, difficult to access, or simply too unstable to investigate safely. So we're left with impressions, tracks in stone. People crossed these broken lands, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. They carried obsidian, camas, stories, perhaps even salmon, across a terrain made of cooled fire. And they left behind just enough to remind us that no terrain is truly impassable. Even if the lava looks empty, it remembers footsteps. And not far from this fractured plain, buried deep in 19th century controversy, lies a mystery that pushes the limits of belief and archaeology. A tiny figurine, reportedly found 300 feet underground. Its existence? Widely doubted. But its discovery? Still unsatisfactorily explained. The Nampa figurine controversy. It's barely 2 inches tall. A clay figure with stubby arms, a rounded torso, and what appears to be a vaguely human face. It has no pedestal, no inscription, no obvious purpose. But according to 19th century accounts, it was not found in a museum, a cave, or a ruin. It was found 300 feet underground in Idaho. Welcome to the Nampa figurine controversy, a mystery that begins in 1889 with a burst of press coverage and has never entirely left the fringes of archaeological debate. Equal parts anomaly, artifact, and accusation, the figurine is either one of the oldest human representations in North America or a carefully planted hoax. The problem? After more than a century, no one's been able to definitively prove either. Here's the story. In July 1889, a group of workers in Nampa, Idaho were drilling an artesian well. The equipment, steam-powered, using a sand pump had reached a depth of around 300 feet when, according to the report, a small object was discharged from the pump and landed in the sand tailings. Upon inspection, it turned out to be the now infamous clay figurine, seemingly anthropomorphic and clearly shaped by human hands. The context, if accurate, was impossible. At 300 feet deep, the layer in question was thought to be part of the Glenn's Ferry Formation, a Pliocene age deposit dated to between 2 and 2.5 million years ago. That would place the figurine well before the accepted time frame for human occupation of the Americas, which even today rarely extends confidently beyond 20,000 years. And so, the debates began. Was it genuine? A planted object? A misinterpretation? A misidentification? The figurine itself was studied extensively in the years following its discovery. G.F. Wright, a prominent geologist and a vocal defender of the artifact's authenticity, argued that its style resembled figurines from early Old World cultures. He saw it as evidence of an extremely ancient human presence in North America, potentially predating not just Clovis, but even modern Homo sapiens. Others were more skeptical. Critics pointed out that the drilling method used essentially a sand pump with high-pressure water could have easily introduced surface materials into the lower layers. The figurine could have been dropped or thrown into the well shaft at any point. Others suggested that the workers, curious or opportunistic, had planted the object either as a joke or as a hoax to gain fame or financial reward. And there's the inconvenient fact that the figurine looks like a 19th century toy. Its form is simple, childlike, even. Unlike other known Paleo-American artifacts, it lacks wear, patina, or stylistic analogues in ancient North American contexts. To some, it resembles mass-produced trinkets from the period, something that might have been found in a child's room rather than an Ice Age camp. Yet, the mystery persists. Because even if it was planted, how exactly did it get down there? Drilling shafts are not open holes. They're narrow, pressurized, and chaotic. Getting a fragile clay object to survive a 300-foot journey intact through active pumping without shattering seems improbable, but not impossible. And here we are, over 130 years later, with no clear answer. The figurine still exists, preserved in collections, sometimes displayed, more often kept in drawers. It's been analyzed with modern techniques, but even today, the results are inconclusive. Thermoluminescence dating has not resolved the question. Petrographic analysis places the clay source near the discovery site, but that only confirms its material origin, not its age. So what are we left with? A single object, wildly out of place, an unverifiable origin story, a context that defies geology, but also defies replication. It's probably a hoax, but like all the best mysteries, probably isn't certainty, and even hoaxes raise questions. If the Nampa figurine was planted, why go to the trouble? Who made it? Who decided to bury it? And for what purpose? Was it a prank? A challenge? A protest? Or something more complicated? Like most archaeological anomalies, the Nampa figurine now exists in limbo, too suspicious to accept, too odd to fully dismiss. And just a few valleys away, scattered across the basalt rims of southern Idaho, there's a different kind of anomaly. One not about a single object, but about patterns in stone lines, piles, alignments that don't quite fit the landscape around them. They're not art, they're not shelter, and we're still not sure what they're for. Rock alignments and cairns. There's a certain irony in how Idaho's most visible prehistoric structures are also the least understood. They don't hide, they don't decay, they don't require excavation or lab testing to be seen. They sit right there, out on the basalt plains, the ridgelines, the high desert plateaus, defiant, subtle, and mostly ignored. We're talking about rock alignments and cairns, lines of stones, deliberate piles, geometric forms clearly placed by human hands, but with unclear intention. What are they? The answers, predictably, are all over the place. Some are interpreted as hunting blinds, strategic formations used to funnel game, particularly antelope or deer, toward ambush points. This theory makes sense in certain contexts. On open plains or gentle slopes, alignments could guide animals without fencing them. Cairns might have held brush or noisemakers to spook herds. In regions like Camas Prairie or the Weiser River Basin, these features align with seasonal game drives and known foraging routes. But not all alignments fit this explanation. Some stretch hundreds of feet, with no obvious terminus or ambush zone. Others form geometric shapes, circles, rectangles, spirals. Some connect to nothing. No tools, no hearths, no camps. Just lines in stone that seem to lead nowhere and stop without reason. In places like Pole Creek, craters of the moon, and the lava rims above the Snake River, archaeologists have found clusters of these features, some with cairns spaced at regular intervals, others forming faint radial patterns. Were they territorial markers, calendrical tools, navigation aids? All have been proposed. None have been proven. Another theory posits that some alignments were ceremonial, not functional, but symbolic. Maybe they tracked solstices, maybe they represented journeys, maybe they mimicked the paths of stars, rivers, or ancestral stories. After all, rock art often occurs nearby, and some alignments terminate at petroglyph panels, cliffs, or elevated viewpoints. That's not random. But here's the challenge: dating them. Rocks don't contain organic material. Unless an alignment is associated with a buried hearth, a datable artifact, or a stratified surface, it can't be carbon dated. Lichenometry has been tried, but it's unreliable in this region. So we're left with patterns, not timelines. And while we can compare styles and distributions, it's not enough to place these features securely within the broader archaeological sequence. What we do know is that some of these alignments and cairns are ancient. Artifacts nearby, obsidian flakes, projectile points, bone tools, suggest occupation and use going back several thousand years. Some may be as old as the early Holocene. Others are clearly younger, perhaps even protohistoric, but the functions still vary. In some oral traditions from the Shoshone and Bannock peoples, cairns are said to represent prayer markers, offerings, or memory points for travelers. Others suggest they mark burials, vision quest sites, or important paths. Some alignments may be remnants of story maps, physical manifestations of narratives that once carried people across this land. And some may simply be what they appear to be, the prehistoric equivalent of "I was here." But even that is meaningful, because what survives of ancient people in Idaho is often fragmentary: a broken tool, a burned bone, a few strokes on stone, but a line of rocks built by hand, placed with intention, still standing after 1,000 winters. That's a message. Even if we no longer speak the language. And perhaps that's the point: to be left with a message you can't read, but can still feel. To stand in a dry wind, look across a high basalt rim, and see a line that ends in nothing, and wonder what it once pointed to. And next, we head into the north, where lines were erased not by time, but by cataclysm. Because when the glacial dam broke, everything changed. And Idaho was never the same. Missoula flood overprints up north. Imagine a wall of water, taller than a skyscraper, roaring across a landscape at 60 miles an hour. Trees, boulders, entire hillsides lifted and carried like driftwood. In its wake, silence and scoured earth. Now imagine that happening not once, but dozens of times, across thousands of years. That's not fiction. That's glacial Lake Missoula, and its repeated catastrophic outbursts, known collectively as the Missoula floods, left a geological legacy so extreme it's visible from space. These floods reshaped large swaths of the Pacific Northwest, carving canyons, depositing erratics, and scouring ancient soils. But here's the problem: Idaho was caught in the crossfire, and it's still not entirely clear what that did to the archaeological record. We know the basics. During the last ice age, a glacial dam repeatedly blocked the Clark Fork River, forming glacial Lake Missoula in what is now western Montana. When the dam failed, which it did, spectacularly, it released up to 500 cubic miles of water in a single burst. That water surged westward, across eastern Washington, down the Columbia River, and, crucially, through northern Idaho. Today, the landscapes of northern Idaho's Rathdrum Prairie, the Purcell Trench, and parts of the Clearwater Basin bear unmistakable signs of these floods: scoured channels, giant ripple marks, gravel bars the size of shopping malls. But what's less visible is what the floods did to whatever human history might have been there before. And that's the core mystery. Because if people were living or even just passing through northern Idaho before or during the Missoula flood events, their traces may have been wiped clean. The floods were erosive, brutally so. They tore away soil, pulverized sediment layers, buried valleys and dozens of meters of new deposits. If campsites, tools, or even bones once lay in these zones, they may now be under 60 feet of glacial silt, or they may be gone entirely. Which leaves archaeologists in a bind. When they go looking for early human activity in this part of Idaho, the usual techniques don't always apply. Stratigraphy is mangled, Radiocarbon samples are out of context. Even when a promising artifact turns up, it's often from a disturbed or unstratified layer, meaning its age is essentially guesswork. And yet, hints persist. Obsidian flakes, isolated tools, a few scattered sites that, while not securely dated to pre-flood times, don't rule it out either. Some landforms in protected areas, like upland benches and bedrock islands, may have escaped the worst of the flooding, and these could, theoretically, preserve remnants of older occupation. But so far, no one's found a smoking hearth that can confirm people were living in flood-affected areas before the megafloods. This leads to a strange kind of reverse detective work. Instead of asking where were people, we're forced to ask where could they possibly have survived. It's not a question of access, it's a question of absence. The archaeological blank spots in flood-affected regions may not reflect a lack of human presence. They may reflect a geological reset. Some researchers think the flooding may have even obscured migration routes. If early peoples entered the Americas via the inland ice-free corridor, a debated theory, but still under consideration, then northern Idaho would have been right in the path. But the sediment laid down by the Missoula floods may have buried the evidence of their passage, leaving us with only downstream traces in Washington or upstream ones in Montana. It's a reminder that archaeology is not just about what survives, it's about what doesn't. And sometimes, what doesn't survive is the loudest clue of all. Because when an entire landscape is overwritten by a geological disaster, it forces us to rethink the stability of history. It reminds us that memory, even when carved in stone or left in bone, can be washed away. What we think of as permanent is only one flood away from erasure. Still, the absence gnaws. It opens more questions than it closes. If people were here, and the broader archaeological consensus says they likely were, then where are their fires, their flakes, their bones? And maybe the better question is, what else have we lost beneath the waters and the rocks and the mud? But for now, let's turn from what's missing to what was built. Because as we enter the mid-Holocene, signs of a new way of life begin to appear on Idaho's landscape pit house villages, clustered near rivers and lakes. But when did they really arrive? And why here? When did housepit lifeways reach Idaho? In the ancient rhythms of the plateau and Intermountain West, the pit house marks a threshold. It's not just a structure, it's a decision, a commitment to place, to seasonality, to permanence in a land where mobility was once the rule. Dug partly into the earth, and often lined with timber, insulated with soil, these circular or oval dwellings began to emerge across the broader plateau during the mid to late Holocene. But in Idaho, the picture is less clear. The central question is deceptively simple. When did housepit lifeways really take root on this side of the border? We know that in eastern Washington and British Columbia, pit houses appear in the archaeological record as early as 4,500 to 5,000 years ago, becoming widespread by 3,000 years ago. These structures weren't isolated huts. They often clustered into villages, some with dozens of dwellings, often located along major rivers, like the Columbia, Fraser, and Thompson. There, the relationship to salmon was obvious. Rivers provided the protein, and house pits provided the seasonal stability to process and store it. In Idaho, however, the spread of pit house architecture seems delayed, or at least uneven. Sites like Lenore, Billy Creek, Hatwai, and others near the Clearwater and Lower Salmon rivers have revealed pit houses dating to roughly 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, sometimes later. These houses show the hallmarks of plateau lifeways: semi-subterranean floors, internal hearths, cache pits, perimeter post holes. But their distribution is patchy. And for decades, archaeologists wondered, was Idaho peripheral to the plateau tradition, or was something else going on? One explanation lies in ecology. Pit houses tend to appear in areas where resource predictability supports semi-sedentary life. That means strong salmon runs, reliable root fields, or seasonal game migrations. Northern Idaho has all of these, but they vary by watershed. The Clearwater, with its high fish productivity and access to Camas, was an ideal zone for village life. The Middle Snake, with more arid conditions and fewer fish, may have supported different, more mobile strategies. But that's only part of the story. Recent research suggests that Idaho's apparent late adoption of pit house lifeways may reflect not cultural lag, but archaeological blind spots. Many Idaho house pit sites were built near rivers, places prone to erosion, floodplain aggradation, and development. That means the earliest structures may have been destroyed, buried, or overlooked. Additionally, early pit houses were often small and shallow, hard to detect without careful excavation. And then there's the cultural nuance. Just because people weren't building deep pit dwellings doesn't mean they weren't living in fixed locations. Surface structures, brush lodges, or other ephemeral dwellings may have preceded or coexisted with pit houses, but left little behind. So what looks like an abrupt shift in the record may in fact be a gradual evolution, one that only becomes archaeologically visible when houses got big enough, deep enough, or formalized enough to leave a footprint. The Nez Perce and Shoshone Bannock, whose ancestors lived in many of these regions, have oral histories that speak of ancient villages, long-term camps, and seasonal returns that stretch far back. Whether those stories align with the emergence of house pits is still being pieced together, but the traditions point to deep continuity, not sudden appearance. What is certain is that by 2,000 years ago, house pit villages were well established in parts of Idaho. They reflect not just architecture, but a transformation in lifeways, from mobile foraging bands to seasonally anchored communities. They allowed for storage, for planning, for wintering in place. They also signal shifts in social organization, possibly more defined group territories, food sharing systems, and emerging leadership roles. And they were often reused. Excavations show that many pit houses were rebuilt multiple times, deepened, expanded, or even burned and reconstructed. That kind of investment isn't casual. It suggests identity, belonging, and memory tied to a physical space. Which brings us to the next pivot. Because, as these village-based lifeways deepened, so did the diet. No longer focused primarily on big game, people began to embrace a broader spectrum. Roots, fish, small mammals, berries. But when did that shift begin? And what drove it? Let's head there next. Big game to broad spectrum. Once upon a time, not in fairy tales, but in Ice Age Idaho, people hunted big things. Mammoths, mastodons, camelids, and Pleistocene bison roamed the grasslands, and the early inhabitants of this raw, cold land followed them with spears tipped in obsidian, bone, and hope. This was the age of the big kill. Large animals provided not only calories, but bones for tools, hides for clothing, and sinew for cordage. One successful hunt could sustain a group for weeks. Or, at least, that's how we used to imagine it. But then the climate changed. Slowly, then all at once. And so did the diet. This is the story of the broad-spectrum revolution, a phrase coined to describe the prehistoric shift from specialized big-game hunting to a more diversified subsistence strategy. In Idaho, this shift is visible in layers of charred seeds, piles of fish bones, grinding stones worn smooth by repetition, and roasting pits filled with the remains of roots and bulbs. But here's the mystery. When exactly did it happen in Idaho? And why? The answer is slippery. Because like so many prehistoric transitions, this wasn't a light switch, it was a slow fade, a drift across centuries, a change in rhythm, not just tools. Archaeologists generally place the beginning of this broad-spectrum shift in the early Holocene, around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, depending on location. By this point, many of the large Pleistocene megafauna were extinct or functionally absent. Some, like bison, persisted but in smaller, more elusive herds. As a result, early Holocene foragers began to place more emphasis on smaller, more reliable resources: rabbits, waterfowl, freshwater mussels, camas, biscuit root, berries, pine nuts, and, eventually, salmon. In Idaho, this transition is especially clear in the Columbia Plateau and Snake River Plain, where assemblages begin to show increasing frequencies of ground, stone tools, manos, and metates for grinding seeds and roots, as well as fish remains, net sinkers, and an uptick in plant processing features like roasting pits and ovens. Sites like Wilson Butte Cave, Redfish Rock Shelter, and others reveal changing toolkits and food residues that suggest a widening menu. But was it just necessity, or was something deeper happening? Some researchers argue that broad-spectrum diets emerged not only as a response to declining big game, but also as a strategic diversification, a way to buffer against environmental variability. Rather than gambling on a mammoth, why not invest in 50 predictable plants? Others suggest social factors. As populations grew and territories became more defined, access to big game ranges may have declined, prompting a focus on locally abundant resources. Add to that the development of storage technologies, baskets, pits, smoking racks, and the value of storable food rose dramatically. Camas, for instance, could be baked, dried, and stored for months. Dried fish traveled well. Pine nuts packed high caloric density into a portable form, and once you can store food, you can plan, you can settle, you can survive bad years without moving. In other words, the broad-spectrum diet wasn't just a shift in food, it was a shift in worldview. But this change didn't happen everywhere at once. In southern Idaho, especially along the Snake River Plain, the shift appears more gradual. Some groups retained a strong emphasis on bison, elk, and deer well into the late Holocene. In higher elevation zones, plant use was always important, but intensified over time as people returned to the same camas fields year after year, leaving behind baking ovens, pit caches, and grinding stones buried in ash. The archaeological evidence reveals regional mosaics. In some places, people leaned heavily into plant economies. In others, fishing became dominant. And in yet others, broad-spectrum diets coexisted with specialized hunting, depending on the season, the basin, or the social context. It's also worth noting that many of the plant foods targeted during this transition were not easy calories. Camas bulbs take days to cook. Seeds need to be gathered, winnowed, ground, and cooked. That investment of time suggests a kind of culinary intelligence, a deep understanding of timing, seasonality, and ecology. People weren't just gathering food, they were managing landscapes, burning meadows to promote plant growth, tending camas patches, timing hunts with migration patterns, and creating technologies to make these foods usable, digging sticks, root bags, earth ovens, net weights, drying racks. It was a full system, and it didn't look anything like the paleo diet. The broad-spectrum shift is often painted as a fall from grace, the end of the mammoth hunt, a descent into grub eating, but that view is both outdated and Eurocentric. In reality, this was a technological and ecological revolution. It reflected deeper knowledge, greater flexibility, and more intimate relationships with the land. It wasn't decline, it was adaptation. And as people diversified their diets and dug their homes into the ground, they also began leaving something else behind. Not bones, not seeds, but stories. Stories carved into stone symbols, spirals, animal forms, handprints, and scattered across Idaho's canyon walls, river corridors, and basalt cliffs. They weren't art in the modern sense. They were messages, maps, memories. And the final mystery is whether they were speaking a shared language or thousands of different ones. Petroglyph, grammar. Across the volcanic corridors of Hell's Canyon, the lower Snake River, and the rugged tributaries of Idaho's wild interior, there is a language with no alphabet. It's written in rock, pecked, scraped, Incised sometimes with delicate precision, sometimes with brute force, these marks form what we call petroglyphs. But that word is a catch-all. It covers everything from deer figures and handprints to abstract spirals, starbursts, zigzags, and serpentine lines. They are silent, but not still. And the question has always been, do they share a grammar? Because if they do, if the petroglyphs of Idaho are not just isolated expressions, but parts of a shared symbolic system, then we are looking at one of the oldest written traditions in North America, not an alphabet, not a script, but a visual language used to record stories, mark territories, track time, or communicate cosmology. The problem is, we don't know. Across Hell's Canyon, the distribution of petroglyphs is dense. Some cliffs contain hundreds of figures. Others are tucked away, solitary, in places that are hard to reach and harder to see. Some panels are clearly layered, older designs patinated nearly black, newer ones superimposed in brighter, rougher strokes. This suggests repetition, reuse, and perhaps even reinterpretation. Stylistically, some motifs recur across vast distances: horned anthropomorphs, hunting scenes, abstract grids. Are these signs of shared culture, shared myth, shared migration, or are we reading too much into coincidence? Some archaeologists argue for a common system. They point to repeated patterns, consistent use of orientation figures facing west, for example, and the spatial layout of symbols within panels. Others caution that without a Rosetta Stone, such interpretations risk projecting order where there may be none. There are practical theories too. Petroglyphs may have marked trail crossings, fishing rites, or seasonal camps. Some may reflect vision quests, each panel the product of an individual experience. Others could be didactic, used to teach oral history, clan lineage, or survival knowledge to the next generation. Ethnographic parallels support all of the above. Many plateau and Great Basin tribes retain oral traditions tied to rock imagery. In some stories, specific petroglyphs are said to represent mythic figures or events: the coyote trickster, the sun's passage, the creation of rivers. Some panels are said to sing, if you know how to listen. Others are meant never to be touched. Some are portals, some are warnings. But translating these images is more than an intellectual challenge, it's a moral one. Because many of these traditions are still sacred, still alive, and to treat them purely as archaeological data is to miss the point entirely. It would be like digging up a cathedral and analyzing the stained glass for pigment content. Still, the question of grammar lingers. If there is a shared system, what are its rules? Are spirals always time? Are dots always people? Do wavy lines always mean water? Or do meanings shift with region, context, and culture? One idea gaining traction is that the petroglyphs may function more like mnemonic anchors than literal statements. In this view, a symbol doesn't say something, it triggers a story. A swirl might evoke a migration myth. A handprint might reference a family. A snake might mark a boundary. The symbol is not the message, it's the key. And that's the paradox. Because to understand the grammar, we must know the stories. But to know the stories, we must understand the grammar. And so we are left in the in-between, a canyon echoing with voices we can no longer quite hear, marks that still shimmer with meaning but defy translation. Maybe that's the final twist, that the mystery of Idaho's petroglyphs is not that we can't read them, but that they weren't meant for us. They were meant for people who already knew, who walked these canyons with memory in their mouths and stone tools in their hands, who left behind not answers, but reminders that we were not the first, and we will not be the last.